An emperor weeps in a monastery, his crown gone, his legacy in flames. His own sons, men who share his blood, have stripped him of his power, publicly shamed him, and now they sharpen their swords not against foreign enemies, but against each other. Across a vast stretch of Europe, from the salty marshes of the North Sea to the sun-baked hills of Italy, the dream of a unified Christian empire is dying. It is not dying with the heroic roar, but with the bitter, confused squabbling of a family tearing itself apart over the inheritance. Villages burn, not from the torches of Viking raiders, but from Frankish soldiers fighting other Frankish soldiers. It is a strange and terrifying time to be alive, a moment when a world that seemed solid and eternal, forged by the great Charlemagne himself, is cracking into pieces right before your very eyes. The map is being redrawn in blood and betrayal. And from these jagged fractures, new kingdoms, new peoples, and new languages are being born in agony. This is the birth of Germany, not in a moment of triumph, but in the chaos of a spectacular family collapse. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments below, please feel free to post your location and what time it is for you as you settle in. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel. Now, let us return to the wreckage of an empire. The weight of it all was simply too much for one man. Charlemagne, the grandfather, had been a figure of mythic proportions, a whirlwind of energy who hammered together an empire with relentless campaigning, shrewd administration, and the sheer force of his personality. He left behind a legacy so immense it crushed his successor, his son Louis, a man known to history, rather unfairly, as the Pious. Louis felt the crushing weight of his father's shadow, the impossible expectation to be a second Charles the Great. He was a deeply religious man in an age that required a warlord. He dreamed of imperial unity, while his own sons dreamed of carving out kingdoms for themselves. He felt their ambition like a constant, dull ache in his bones, the scrape of their knives as they carved away at his authority. He tried to plan an orderly succession, dividing the realm in a way he thought was fair. But every plan he made was met with greed and rebellion. His sons, Lothair, Louis, and Charles, rose against him and against each other in a dizzying series of alliances and betrayals. It was less a civil war and more a decade-long, empire-wide brawl. When Louis the Pious finally died in 840, his passing was not a moment of sorrow, but the firing of a starting pistol. The final, brutal contest for the spoils began. Lothair, the eldest, claimed the grand imperial title and the wealthiest, most prestigious middle slice of the empire. This kingdom, called Middle Francia, was a geographical absurdity, a long, indefensible ribbon of land stretching from the Netherlands all the way down through the Alps to northern Italy. It had the old imperial capital of Aachen and the holy city of Rome, but it had no natural coherence. It was a kingdom designed by an ego, not a map maker. To the west, the youngest son, Charles the Bald, took the lands that would one day become France. And to the east, the second son, also named Louis, and forever after known as Louis the German, received a sprawling, wild territory of forests and rivers that was just beginning to find its voice. This division was formalized in the year 843 by the Treaty of Verdun. One can almost feel the exhaustion in the air as the diplomats and bishops met, the scent of dust and stale parchment. They weren't building a future. They were desperately trying to stop the bleeding. The lines they drew on the map were meant to give each brother a roughly equal share of royal estates and resources, but in doing so, they created the fault lines of European conflict for the next 1,000 years. Louis the German's new kingdom, East Francia, was a patchwork quilt of ancient tribes who were still getting used to the idea of being called Franks. He was now king over the proud and rebellious Saxons in the north, the cerebral Franks of Franconia in the center, the boisterous Bavarians in the southeast, and the stubborn Swabians, or Alemanni, to the southwest. These weren't so much provinces as they were near independent duchies, each with its own laws, its own dialect, and its own powerful duke, who viewed the king as, at best, a distant cousin whose advice could be cheerfully ignored. Holding this kingdom together was less like governing and more like trying to keep 5 angry cats in a sack. A year before the treaty, a profound moment had revealed just how deep the divisions had become. At Strasbourg, Louis the German and his half-brother, Charles the Bald, met to swear a formal alliance against their elder brother, Lothair. To ensure their armies understood the pact, the two kings did something revolutionary. Charles, standing before the East Frankish troops, swore his oath not in his native tongue, and not in the official Latin of the court, but in Teodisca lingua, the German tongue, what we now call Old High German. Then Louis, in turn, addressed Charles's soldiers in the lingua romana, the early form of French. It was a stark admission that the one great empire now had two distinct peoples, no longer able to easily understand one another. For a warrior from Bavaria, hearing his Frankish king speak in the melodic, flowing sounds of the West must have been as strange as hearing a voice from another world, a clear signal that their paths were diverging forever. And as if the internal squabbling wasn't enough, this fledgling Eastern kingdom found itself besieged from all sides. From the north, the rivers became highways for the sleek, dragon-proud longships of the Vikings. They didn't come to conquer land, not at first. They came for portable wealth, striking with terrifying speed at monasteries and trading towns along the Rhine and the Elbe, taking gold, silver, and slaves before melting back into the mists. To feel their approach was to know a unique kind of dread, the lookout's horn, the frantic ringing of a church bell, the smell of smoke on the wind. At the same time, from the vast, open plains of the east, a new terror emerged. The Magyars, nomadic horsemen from the steppes, swept into Bavaria and Saxony like a storm. They were master archers who seemed born in the saddle, and their lightning raids left nothing but ashes and ruin. This vulnerable new kingdom, East Francia, was born screaming, fighting for its life against its own internal fractures and the predators circling from without. It was a kingdom born screaming, and for decades it never truly stopped. The line of Louis the German, the Carolingian blood that was supposed to be the realm's unifying thread, grew thin and then snapped. The last of his direct descendants, a boy king named Louis the Child, died in 911, leaving behind a throne that was little more than a fancy chair and a kingdom on the verge of shattering completely. The real power wasn't with the king. It was with the great dukes, those stem dukes who ruled the old tribal lands. They were the ones who commanded the armies, collected the taxes, and inspired the loyalty of their people. They felt the phantom weight of a crown on their own heads. For a tense moment, it seemed the whole experiment of East Francia was over, that it would fly apart into 5 squabbling pieces. In a desperate bid for unity, the Dukes of Franconia, Swabia, and Bavaria chose one of their own, Conrad of Franconia, to be the new king. It was a disaster. Conrad, a man who believed in the old Carolingian ideal of a strong, centralized monarchy, spent his entire reign trying to beat the other dukes into submission, which, unsurprisingly, only made them fight back harder. He bled his kingdom dry fighting his own people, all while the Magyar horsemen burned the undefended south and the Vikings raided the north. On his deathbed in 918, Conrad did the single most important thing of his reign. He admitted he had failed. He felt the cold truth settling in his bones. The only man who could hold the kingdom together was his fiercest rival, the powerful and pragmatic Duke of Saxony, a man named Henry. He ordered his own brother, Eberhard, to take the royal insignia, the holy lance, the sword, the crown, and offer them to the Saxon. One can only imagine that journey. Eberhard of Franconia riding north into the lands of his enemy, carrying the symbols of a kingdom he believed his family should rule, all to hand them over to a man he had fought against for years. It must have felt like the ultimate surrender. The Franconian delegation found Henry not in a great hall-holding court, but out in the field near Quedlinburg, his mind entirely focused on the delicate business of mending his bird-catching nets. There's a quiet humor to the scene. This rugged Saxon duke, utterly absorbed in his hobby, looking up in surprise as a group of nobles, his sworn enemies no less, awkwardly clear their throats and offer him a kingdom. It's perhaps the only time in history a man was offered a crown while smelling faintly of birds, a fact that earned him the nickname he would carry forever. Henry the Fowler. He accepted, but on his own terms. When the Archbishop of Mainz stepped forward at the coronation assembly in Fritzlar, ready to perform the sacred rite of anointing, the ritual that symbolized the king receiving his power from God, in the tradition of Charlemagne, Henry held up a hand and refused. He felt no need for it. He was a Saxon, chosen by his fellow dukes, and he believed that was grace enough. To him, the consent of his peers on earth was more important than a bishop's holy oil. This small act of refusal was a quiet earthquake. It was a declaration that this new German kingdom would not be a mere continuation of the old Frankish model. Henry's power, he was signaling, came from the drawn swords and sworn oaths of the powerful men who elected him, not from a divine mandate inherited from Rome. He would not be a sacred emperor-king in a jeweled crown, but a pragmatic leader, a first among equals, whose authority had to be earned and maintained every single day. This was a job, not a calling, and he was determined to do it well. His first task was to deal with those other angry cats in a sack, the powerful dukes of Swabia and Bavaria, who hadn't bothered to show up for his election. Conrad had tried to crush them with force. Henry used something far more effective: respect. He rode south to meet them, but not with an invading army. He met Duke Burchard of Swabia and confirmed his right to rule his own lands, to appoint his own bishops, to be In essence, a king within his own duchy, so long as he recognized Henry as the ultimate king of the realm. He did the same with Arnulf of Bavaria, the most powerful and rebellious of them all, a man who styled himself Duke by the grace of God. Henry let him keep his power over the church, his right to collect tolls, everything, in exchange for a simple acknowledgement of his kingship. It was a brilliant strategy. By giving them what they already had, he neutralized them as rivals and transformed them into partners. He was building a federation, not an empire, bound by personal oaths and mutual self-interest. With the home front secure, he turned to the terrifying threat from the east. He knew the Saxon and Franconian levies were no match for the Magyar horse archers on an open field. He needed time. His chance came when his forces managed to capture a high-ranking Magyar prince. When the Magyars sent envoys to negotiate a ransom, Henry offered a deal that must have stunned them. He would release the prince and pay a handsome annual tribute for 9 years. In exchange, he wanted only one thing: peace. The Magyars, likely thinking the Germans were cowards, agreed. Henry had just bought his kingdom 9 years of life. He used every single day. He issued a decree known as the Burgenordnung, a massive national infrastructure and defense project. All across Saxony and Thuringia, old crumbling forts were rebuilt, and new walled enclosures, the Burgen, were constructed. He ordered that 1 out of every 9 farmers be drafted, moved inside these new fortifications with their families, and trained as a professional garrison soldier, while the other 8 worked the fields to support them. It was the birth of the German walled town. At the same time, he retrained his army, shifting the focus from infantry levies to a new force of heavily armored cavalry, an elite corps of knights who could finally meet the Magyars on their own terms. In 933, the 9 years were up. A Magyar embassy arrived to collect the tribute. Henry, in a moment of high drama, threw a dead dog at their feet. The message was clear. The payments were over. War was on. At the Battle of Riyadh, on a riverbank in Thuringia, Henry's new army got its test. For the first time, the German knights held their ground, their shields forming a solid wall against the rain of arrows. Then they charged. The impact of heavy lancers crashing into the light Magyar cavalry was devastating. The invaders, who had terrorized Europe for a generation, broke and fled. It wasn't a final, crushing victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The spell of Magyar invincibility was broken. Henry the Fowler, the reluctant king who was offered a crown while tending his nets, had taken a broken kingdom, stitched it together with diplomacy, and forged it a shield and a sword. He gave it its first moment of shared victory, a flicker of a common German identity born in the fire of shared defense. The fire of victory at Riyadh had warmed the German duchies, but it was the quiet pragmatism of Henry the Fowler that had kept the embers from scattering. When he died in 936, he left behind a kingdom that was, for the first time, more or less at peace with itself. He had designated his son Otto, born from his second marriage to the saintly Matilda of Ringelheim, as his successor. But if the German dukes expected the son to rule like the father, they were in for a profound shock. Otto was a different man entirely. Where Henry was a Saxon first and a king second, a man who refused the church's consecration, Otto saw himself as a king in the grandest sense. His coronation was not a simple affair among peers in Fritzlar. at a spectacular ceremony in the ancient eight-sided cathedral at Aachen, the hallowed palace chapel of Charlemagne himself. He sat on Charlemagne's throne, a simple, massive chair of white marble, feeling the cold stone and the immense weight of history. He was anointed by the archbishops, girded with the imperial sword, and crowned as king of the Franks and Saxons. Every gesture, every prayer, every piece of regalia was a deliberate message. The time of the king as a mere first among equals was over. The successor to Charlemagne had arrived. This grand vision, however, immediately collided with the messy reality of family politics. It seems to be a rule of history that the greater a ruler's ambition, the more troublesome his relatives become. And Otto had a truly world-class collection of difficult family members. His own half-brother, Thankmar, feeling cheated of the succession, rose in rebellion. Otto besieged him in a church, and Thankmar was cut down at the altar, clutching a sacred relic. Then, more seriously, his own younger brother Henry, his mother's favorite, launched a far more dangerous conspiracy, believing he had a better claim to the throne. He allied himself with the powerful Duke of Franconia, and even schemed with the French king to overthrow Otto. The young king felt the sting of this betrayal keenly, the bitterness of having to hunt his own brother like an outlaw. He put down the revolt with a core of ruthless energy, capturing the conspirators and executing most of them. He forgave his brother Henry, not once, but twice after a second rebellion, eventually deciding the best way to control him was to give him what he wanted: a duchy. He made Henry the new Duke of Bavaria, a policy he would repeat, seizing rebellious duchies and installing his own relatives as their rulers. On paper, it was a brilliant plan for centralization. In practice, it just meant his future family squabbles would now involve entire armies. While wrestling with his endlessly plotting relatives, Otto was forging the most powerful and enduring tool of his reign. He saw that the secular dukes, even his own family, were inherently untrustworthy. Their power was hereditary. Their lands and titles passed to their sons, creating rival dynasties. But there was another set of princes in his kingdom: the bishops and the great abbots. These men could not marry or produce legitimate heirs. So Otto began a revolutionary policy. He started investing the leaders of the church, not just with spiritual authority, but with vast tracts of land, the right to collect taxes, mint coins, and administer justice. He turned his bishops into feudal lords, loyal administrators who governed huge territories for him. In return, he claimed the right to appoint these men himself, choosing educated, loyal, and capable clerics for the most important posts. It was a masterstroke, what historians call the Ottonian system. He was creating a counterweight to the troublesome secular nobility, an imperial civil service that was utterly dependent on him and whose lands would always return to the crown. It was the medieval equivalent of a CEO backing the board of directors with his own hand-picked team. This internal consolidation of power came just in time, because the old Magyar threat, which had been dormant since the Battle of Riyadh, returned with a vengeance. Seeing the Germans preoccupied with their internal rebellions, the Magyars sensed weakness. In the summer of 955, they launched a massive invasion, a force so large it stunned the German frontier. They flooded across Bavaria, and into Swabia, laying siege to the vital city of Augsburg. The city's bishop, a man of iron well named Ulrich, organized a desperate defense, his priests and monks standing on the walls beside the soldiers. Word of the crisis reached Otto, who acted with stunning speed. He put aside his conflicts and called the banners of all the German tribes. For the first time, a truly pan-German army assembled. Bavarians marching alongside their old rivals, the Swabians, Franks fighting next to Saxons, all united by a single existential threat. This was not just another raid. This was a war for survival. On a scorching hot August day, on the floodplain of the Lech River near Augsburg, Otto's army met the Magyar horde. The air was thick with dust and the smell of sweat and nervous horses. Otto rode before his troops, not with a crown, but with a helmet and a sacred relic, the Holy Lance, believed to be the very spear that had pierced the side of Christ. He raised it high, casting this not as a battle between peoples, but as a holy war between Christians and heathens. The battle was a chaotic, swirling nightmare. The swift Magyar horsemen, firing their deadly composite bows, nearly succeeded in their classic tactic of feigned retreat and encirclement, overwhelming Otto's rearguard. For a moment, it seemed disaster was imminent. But Otto rallied his elite heavy cavalry and led a furious, decisive charge directly into the heart of the Magyar force. The impact was horrific. The heavily armored German knights, fighting with lance and sword, smashed through the lightly armored Magyars. The Magyar lines shattered, their discipline broke, and the battle turned into a rout, and then a slaughter. Otto's forces pursued the fleeing enemy for days, giving no quarter. The three captured Magyar chieftains were taken to Regensburg and publicly hanged. The Magyar threat, which had haunted Germany for more than half a century, was over. That evening, on the blood-soaked field, the victorious German dukes and their soldiers spontaneously lifted their shields and hailed Otto in the old Roman style, proclaiming him Imperator, Emperor. This victory, the Battle of Lechfeld, echoed across Christendom. Otto was no longer just the German king. He was the savior of Europe. This immense prestige, combined with the chaotic and corrupt state of politics in Italy, gave him his ultimate opportunity. The papacy, at a low point in its history, was being bullied by local Italian strongmen. The dissolute young Pope John XIII sent a desperate appeal for help to the great hero of Lechfeld. In 961, Otto marched his army over the Alps. It was a triumphal procession. The cities of northern Italy opened their gates to him. On February the 2nd, 962, in the ancient Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, the Pope placed the imperial crown on the head of Otto and his wife, Adelaide. The feeling must have been electric, a moment where the past and future converged. The Roman Empire, the legacy of Charlemagne, was reborn. It was now a German king who wore the crown, a Saxon from the northern forests who now claimed the mantle of the Caesars, creating a new, powerful, and deeply complex entity, the Holy Roman Empire. The cold weight of the imperial crown, once settled on Otto's brow, came with an equally heavy burden. Italy, the grand universal title of emperor, was inextricably linked to Rome, and being master of Rome meant being entangled in the viper's nest of Italian politics. The very Pope who had crowned him, John X, a young man from the Roman aristocracy, known more for his decadent lifestyle than his piety, almost immediately regretted his decision. As soon as Otto marched back over the Alps, John began plotting against him. Otto, feeling the sharp sting of ingratitude, had to turn his entire army around, march all the way back to Rome, and convene a synod of bishops to deal with the troublesome pontiff. The list of charges read out against the Pope was truly spectacular, including sacrilege, murder, and adultery, prompting one of the more memorable, if possibly invented, jokes in medieval history. The bishops toasted to the devil. Otto had Pope John XIII formally deposed and installed a new, more reliable pope in his place. This set a dangerous but necessary precedent. For the next century, being Holy Roman Emperor meant that part of the job description was marching to Rome every so often to fire the Pope. This deep and lasting entanglement with Italy became the central question of Ottonian rule, and indeed of the entire medieval German Empire. Historians still argue whether the Italian adventure was the crowning achievement of the German kings or a catastrophic diversion of resources and attention. On one hand, the imperial crown gave the German king a status no other monarch in Europe could claim. It lifted him above the fractious dukes, legitimized his rule with the legacy of the Caesars and Charlemagne, and made him the designated protector of the church. But the cost was immense. The long marches south drained the royal treasury, and the emperor's frequent and prolonged absences from Germany allowed the great nobles back home to plot, to build up their power, and to chip away at the royal authority that Otto and his father had so carefully constructed. It was a grand and glorious vision. This revived Roman Empire, but it was a vision that had to be paid for with German blood and treasure, year after year. While the emperor himself was often physically absent, the system he had created kept the German kingdom running. The great prince bishops and abbots, his hand-picked men, were the true bedrock of the empire. Loyal, educated, and with no legitimate heirs to threaten the crown, they governed their vast territories, collected taxes, and provided the king with his best soldiers and administrators. This network of powerful churchmen provided a stability the kingdom had never known before. And with stability came a remarkable flowering of culture. After the long, dark, and violent centuries of Viking and Magyar raids, the relative peace of Otto's reign allowed for a renewed focus on art, architecture, and learning. This Ottonian Renaissance was not a rebirth of classical humanism like the later Italian version. It was a deeply Christian revival, centered not in secular cities, but in the great imperial monasteries and cathedral schools. These were the vibrant intellectual and artistic hearts of the empire. Within the stone walls of abbeys like Fulda, Reichenau, and St. Gall, and especially in the great convents of Quedlinburg and Gandersheim, which were often ruled by brilliant women from the royal family itself, a new confidence shone forth. In the scriptoria, the quiet, focused rooms for writing, monks and nuns sat hunched over desks, their quills scratching away on prepared sheets of vellum. They were not just copying the Bible. They were creating some of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts ever produced, their pages glowing with vibrant colors and burnished gold leaf. In the abbey schools, the sons of the nobility were educated, And from these schools came the next generation of bishops and administrators who would run the empire. And in one of these convents at Gandersheim, a canoness named Hrotsvita was doing something utterly astonishing. She was reading the plays of the ancient Roman comedic writer, Terence, and adapting his style to write her own Latin plays, the first in Europe for over 500 years. Her works were not comedies, but deeply felt dramas about the lives of saints and the virtue of Christian martyrs, written with a skill and intellectual flair that was a testament to the high level of learning this new age made possible. For Otto the Great, consolidating his power in Germany and Italy was not enough. To be a true successor to the Roman emperors, he needed recognition from the only other polity that could claim the title, the ancient, fantastically wealthy, and profoundly arrogant Byzantine Empire, which still ruled from Constantinople. Otto embarked on a long and frustrating diplomatic mission to secure a marriage between his son and heir, also named Otto, and a Byzantine princess. The negotiations were a clash of cultures. To the Germans, whose court was still largely mobile, rough-hewn, and focused on hunting and war, the Byzantines were paragons of civilization. To the Byzantines, who saw themselves as the sole inheritors of Rome, the Germans were little more than fur-clad barbarians. Otto's first envoy was, according to his own bitter letters home, treated with contempt and thrown in prison. But Otto was persistent. Eventually, a new Byzantine emperor saw the strategic value of an alliance, and in 972, a glittering delegation arrived in Italy, bringing a bride. She was not, as Otto had hoped, a porphyrogenita, a princess born in the purple chamber of the imperial palace, but a highly intelligent and well-educated niece of the emperor named Theophanu. Her arrival in Rome for the wedding was a spectacle. She brought with her the scent of a different world, chests of silk and ivory, strange perfumes and spices, and a refined courtly culture that must have seemed alien to the German knights and nobles. The marriage of Otto II and Theophanu was more than a personal union. It was a symbolic merging of East and West. It was the final triumph for Otto the Great. He had defeated the Magyars, subdued his rebellious family, revived the Western Empire, tamed the papacy, and now he had forced the Caesars of the East to recognize his dynasty as their equals, bringing a brilliant star from the sophisticated Byzantine firmament to shine in the heart of his German Empire. In 973, the great emperor Otto V died peacefully in his favored palace at Memleben, in the heart of his native Saxony. The torch was passed to his son, Otto II, a man who had been crowned co-king and co-emperor for years, groomed for this very moment. He was energetic, educated, and at 22 shared his father's ambition, but not, perhaps, his father's cautious political instincts. He had grown up hearing tales of the great victory at Lechfeld, and had stood beside his father at the imperial court. He felt the immense pressure to live up to that legacy, to prove that he was not merely the son of a great man, but a great man in his own right. His marriage to the brilliant Byzantine princess Theophanu only amplified this pressure, constantly reminding him of the glorious, truly Roman standard of emperorship, where his father's gaze had always been divided between Germany and Italy. Otto II's attention was drawn, almost fatally, to the south. After dealing with the seemingly obligatory family rebellion, this time from a cousin, another Henry, nicknamed the Wrangler, who made a play for the Bavarian duchy. Otto II focused his energies on a grand project, the conquest of southern Italy, a chaotic land divided between Lombard princes, Byzantine holdouts, and Arab emirs who ruled Sicily. It was an ambition that would lead him to ruin. In 982, he marched a large and confident German-Italian army deep into the southern peninsula, aiming to drive the Saracens from the mainland. Near Cape Colonna, on the coast of Calabria, his magnificent army of knights was lured into a trap. In the brutal summer heat, a Saracen force under the Emir of Sicily feigned a retreat, then turned and attacked the imperial army as it was strung out and disorganized. The result was a catastrophe. The heavy German cavalry, so effective on the plains of the Lechfeld, was bogged down and annihilated. Nobles and bishops were cut down, and the imperial army was almost completely destroyed. Otto II himself felt the terror of the rout, escaping only by frantically spurring his horse into the sea and swimming to a nearby Byzantine ship, which, in a final ironic twist, only rescued him when he revealed his identity. It was a shattering humiliation. As he was trying to regroup, even worse news arrived from the north. A massive pagan Slavic confederation, seeing the empire's weakness, had risen up in a great rebellion along the Elbe River, burning churches, killing priests, and undoing an entire generation of German colonization and missionary work. In a single year, Otto II's world had collapsed. A year later, while in Rome planning his revenge, he contracted malaria and died suddenly. He was only 28. He left behind him an empire in crisis and an heir, Otto III, who was a mere 3-year-old child. The vultures began to circle immediately. Henry the Wrangler, freed from captivity, saw his chance and had the young boy abducted, attempting to have himself declared king. But he had underestimated two of the most formidable political figures of the age: the boy's mother and grandmother. The Empress Theophanu, using every ounce of her Byzantine intelligence and diplomatic skill, forged an alliance of archbishops and dukes to oppose the usurper. Alongside her was the formidable dowager Empress Adelaide, Otto the Great's widow, a woman of immense prestige and political experience. Together, these two women outmaneuvered Henry, forced him to return the child king, and established a joint regency. For the next decade, the vast Holy Roman Empire was ruled, and ruled effectively, by two women. Theophanu, in particular, governed with a firm hand, issuing charters in her own name as Imperator Augustus, the male form of the title, a bold assertion of her power. She secured the borders, maintained peace within the realm, and ensured her son received the finest education possible. When Theophanu died and Otto III finally came of age, the product of this unique upbringing was a type of ruler Germany had never seen before. His father and grandfather were fundamentally Saxons, pragmatic warriors who had acquired an empire. Otto III was something else entirely. Raised by a Greek mother, surrounded by learned churchmen, and tutored by the most brilliant scholar of the age, the Frenchman Gerbert of Aurillac, Otto was a prodigy, a mystic, and a dreamer. He was fluent in German, Latin, and Greek, and his head was filled not with the sagas of Saxon heroes, but with the grand ideals of ancient Rome. and the universal theories of Christian philosophy. He felt less of a connection to the cold forests of Germany than he did to the sun-bleached ruins of the Eternal City. His reign was dominated by a single, breathtakingly ambitious idea: the Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the renewal of the Roman Empire. This was not just a renewal of the title, but a conscious attempt to restore the empire to its ancient, universal glory, with its heart beating once more in Rome itself. He broke with a century of tradition, moved his court from Germany, and built a magnificent palace on the Aventine Hill overlooking the city. He abandoned the straightforward German court etiquette for elaborate, symbolic rituals drawn from ancient Roman and Byzantine practice. The German dukes and Saxon warriors who came south to see him were utterly baffled. They would arrive expecting to see their king, a warlord they could advise and drink with, and instead they found an almost priestly figure, dressed in exotic robes, styling himself servant of Jesus Christ and servant of the apostles, who preferred to dine alone on a raised dais and discuss Greek philosophy. It must have felt to them like their tough, pragmatic family business had been taken over by a brilliant but eccentric grandson who was trying to run it based on a book of poetry. To create his new world, he shattered old conventions. He appointed his 24-year-old cousin, a German, as Pope Gregory IV, shocking the Roman nobility, who had always treated the papacy as their personal property. When Gregory was temporarily driven out, Otto marched on the city and brutally suppressed the revolt, then installed his revered tutor, Gerbert, as Pope Sylvester II. The choice of name was pure symbolic genius. The first Pope Sylvester had reigned alongside the first Christian Roman emperor, Constantine the Great. Now, a new Sylvester would guide the church alongside a new, philosophically minded emperor. In the millennial year 1000, Otto made a pilgrimage that revealed the core of his mystical vision. He traveled to Aachen and ordered the tomb of Charlemagne to be opened. There, he looked upon the body of his great predecessor, said to be found sitting upright on his throne, perfectly preserved. He took a cross from Charlemagne's neck and a piece of his cloak, a silent, morbid communion with the founder of his imperial dream. But the dream was too fragile for the real world. The Romans, resentful of this foreign emperor and his German pope, rose in a furious revolt in 1001 and besieged him in his palace. Otto was forced to flee the city he loved, his heart broken. A year later, preparing an army to reconquer Rome, he died of a sudden fever, just 21 years old. His grand renewal was over, and his body was carried by his loyal German soldiers on a long, sad journey back over the Alps, away from the Roman dream, to be buried beside Charlemagne in the cold ground of Aachen. The German soldiers, carrying the body of their young, brilliant, and tragically dead emperor back over the Alps, were not just carrying a corpse. They were carrying the death of a dynasty. Otto III left no son, no brother, no clear heir. The direct line of Henry the Fowler and Otto the Great, the Saxon blood that had forged Germany, was extinguished. The result was a chaotic scramble for the throne. After a messy and contested election, the crown passed to a distant cousin, Henry, the Duke of Bavaria, who became Henry II. He was a pious and hard-working man, but he spent his entire reign just trying to hold the empire together, rushing from one ducal rebellion to another, his authority constantly questioned. When he too died childless in 1024, the German kingdom faced a moment of supreme uncertainty. Who would wear the crown now? The answer came from a great assembly of nobles on the flat, open meadows of Kamba, on the banks of the Rhine. It was a picture of the kingdom in miniature. Thousands of tents sprouted like mushrooms. The great dukes and archbishops arrived with their private armies, their banners snapping in the wind. A sea of anxious and ambitious men gathered to choose a king. The air must have hummed with the sound of rumors, of hurried negotiations in shadowy tents, of oaths sworn and bargains struck. Two main candidates emerged, both named Conrad, both from the Salian clan in Franconia, distant relatives of the Ottonians. The decision fell to the Archbishop of Mainz, who, in a moment of high political theatre, moved down the line of dukes, asking each one for their vote. He started with the younger Conrad, who, seeing he did not have the support, cleverly voted for his rival. One by one, the other dukes followed suit, and the elder Conrad was elected king. He was Conrad II, the first of the Salian dynasty. If Otto III was a mystic and a dreamer, Conrad II was a hammer. He was a middle-aged, hard-headed Franconian noble, a man with no grand illusions about a universal Roman Empire. He was intensely practical, legally minded, and possessed a relentless drive to restore and enhance the power, and, most importantly, the wealth of the monarchy. He felt that the Ottonians, in their piety and their focus on the imperial title, had allowed too many of the crown's lands and rights to slip into the hands of the dukes and the bishops. His reign was, in essence, a massive and successful corporate restructuring of the German kingdom. Immediately after his coronation, he embarked on a grueling tour of the realm, a traditional procession known as the Königsumritt, traveling for months on end through every duchy, showing himself to his subjects, holding court, and demanding oaths of loyalty. It was a physical assertion of his rule, a message that the king was not an abstract ideal in Rome, but a very real and present power. His focus was on the Reichsgut, the material possessions of the crown. He was like a shrewd property magnate, hunting down every lost royal estate, every forgotten toll right, every piece of land that had been illegally seized during the previous decades of instability. He and his legal advisors pored over old charters and documents, looking for any angle to reclaim what he saw as rightfully the king's. His greatest success was the entirely peaceful acquisition of the Kingdom of Burgundy in 1032. Through a clever piece of inheritance diplomacy, this vast and wealthy territory, covering what is now western Switzerland and the Rhone Valley in France, was added to the Holy Roman Empire, a third crown alongside those of Germany and Italy. Conrad's philosophy was simple and unsentimental. The basis of royal power was not a mystical connection to Charlemagne, but the ownership of land, castles, and sources of income. To manage this newly consolidated royal estate and to exert his authority, Conrad relied heavily on a new class of royal servant that would become the signature of Salian rule, the ministeriales. These were not high-born nobles or powerful bishops. They were unfree knights, men who were legally serfs, the personal property of the king, but who were trained as soldiers and administrators. Because they were unfree, they owed the king absolute, unquestioning loyalty. They could not pass their offices to their sons. and their fortunes depended entirely on royal favor. Conrad and his successors began to use these ministeriales for everything. They were made stewards of the new royal castles being built across the land. They served as officials in the royal administration, and they formed the hardcore of the royal army. To the old, free nobility, the dukes and counts who traced their lineage back for generations, this was a profound insult. They felt their traditional roles as the king's advisors and warriors were being usurped by these upstarts, these legally unfree men who were now giving them orders. It was a source of deep and simmering resentment. This growing tension between the crown and the high aristocracy was the defining feature of the Salian age. While Conrad II himself was a powerful and respected ruler who largely kept the peace through the sheer force of his will, the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The great dukes were becoming more powerful, more independent. They were building their own networks of loyal vassals, strengthening their own castles, and beginning to treat their duchies less like public offices and more like private, hereditary kingdoms. The old Ottonian system of a loyal, royally appointed church was still in place. But even here, new ideas were stirring, whispers of a reform movement that sought to free the church from the control of kings and emperors. Conrad II, the great pragmatist, left to his son Henry III a kingdom that was outwardly stronger and wealthier than ever. The royal coffers were full, the territory was larger, and the administration was more efficient. But this strength was brittle. He had papered over deep cracks in the foundation of the empire, creating a powerful but resented royal authority that was on a collision course with the ambitions of the territorial princes and the dawning revolutionary ideas of the church. Henry III inherited a kingdom that felt like the pinnacle of creation. The son of the pragmatic Conrad II, he was a different breed of ruler entirely, a man possessed of a deep, almost severe piety and an unshakable belief in his own sacred role. He felt the weight of his office not as a political burden, but as a divine calling. The empire was strong, the nobles were quiet, and the king's authority seemed absolute. To Henry, the German king was not merely a secular ruler. He was the anointed deputy of Christ on earth, responsible for the well-being of all Christendom. This meant he had a sacred duty to oversee the church, and he took this duty very seriously. When he traveled to Italy in 1046 for his imperial coronation, he found the papacy, the very heart of the church, in a state of utter scandal. 3 different men were all claiming to be the rightful pope, creating a schism that horrified the faithful. For an emperor like Henry, a man who craved order and piety, this was an intolerable mess. At a church council, he convened at Sutri. He exercised his imperial power in the most dramatic way possible. He deposed all 3 rival popes and appointed his own candidate, a virtuous German bishop. It was the high water mark of imperial control. In the years that followed, he would single-handedly appoint a succession of German popes, believing he was cleansing the church of its corruption and installing good, pious leaders. He was, in a sense, a great reformer himself, but in doing so, he fatally underestimated the power of the very ideas he was importing to Rome. For a century, a slow-burning fire of spiritual renewal had been spreading across Europe. emanating from the great Burgundian Abbey of Cluny. This Cluniac reform was a passionate call to purify a church that had grown too worldly, too entangled in the grubby business of feudal politics. The reformers had two main targets. The first was simony, the buying and selling of church offices. It was common practice for a king or duke to sell a bishopric to the highest bidder, treating it like any other piece of property. The second was clerical marriage or concubinage. Many priests, and even bishops, had wives and children, which meant church land and property were often passed down as a private family inheritance. To the zealous reformers, these practices were corrupt and sinful. Their ultimate goal was a radical one: libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the church. They dreamed of a church that was completely independent from the control of laymen, be they counts, dukes, or even the emperor himself. The most passionate, brilliant, and unbending advocate of this new vision was a small, fiery Tuscan monk of humble origins named Hildebrand. While these revolutionary ideas were taking hold in Rome under the very German popes Henry III had appointed, the empire was thrown into chaos. In 1056, Henry III died suddenly, leaving the throne to his son, Henry IV, a boy of just 6. A long and disastrous minority followed. The great dukes, who had chafed under the strong hand of the last two kings, saw their chance to reclaim power. The young king's mother, the Empress Agnes, was a capable but politically weak regent. In a shocking act of political gangsterism, a group of nobles, led by the ambitious Archbishop Anno of Cologne, kidnapped the young Henry, sailing away with him on a ship down the Rhine as the boy wept on the deck. He was then raised as a ward of the feuding German princes. It was a deeply traumatic childhood, instilling in Henry a lifelong suspicion of the high nobility and a fierce, stubborn determination to reclaim the royal power that he felt was being stolen from him. As Henry IV grew into manhood, fighting to assert his authority against rebellious dukes, especially the perennially troublesome Saxons, his old tutor, Hildebrand, was rising in Rome. In 1073, at the funeral of the Pope, the Roman crowd, in a frenzy of excitement, seized Hildebrand and acclaimed him as their new pontiff. He took the name Gregory VII. The contrast between the two men, who were now set on a collision course, could not have been more stark. Henry IV was a king who felt his traditional, inherited rights were under attack from all sides and was determined to defend them. Gregory VII was a revolutionary, a man who felt he was the chosen instrument of God, tasked with establishing a new world order. In his mind, the Pope was not just the leader of the Church. He was the supreme authority on earth, with the power to judge and even depose any secular ruler, including the emperor. The explosion came in 1075. Henry IV, having finally won a major victory over the rebellious Saxons, felt secure enough to reassert his authority in Italy. He appointed a new archbishop for the powerful see of Milan, following the long-established custom of his ancestors. For Gregory, this was the final straw. This was lay investiture, the very symbol of secular control over the church, and he would not tolerate it. He sent Henry a letter condemning his actions. Shortly after, a document began to circulate from Gregory's chancellery called the Dictatus Papae, or Dictates of the Pope. It was a list of 27 breathtakingly bold assertions of papal power. including the claim that the Pope may depose emperors and may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men. This was a declaration of war. Henry IV, feeling his entire world order threatened, reacted with fury. In January 1076, he convened a council of German bishops at the city of Worms. These bishops, who were, after all, his appointees and relied on his favor, dutifully declared that Gregory VII was a usurper and a false monk, and that they no longer owed him obedience. Henry then penned a personal, incandescently angry letter to the Pope. He addressed it not to Pope Gregory, but to Hildebrand, at present not an apostolic pope, but a false monk. It was a stream of personal invective, accusing him of every sin, and it ended with a stunning command. I, Henry, king by the grace of God, say to you, together with all our bishops, come down, and be damned throughout the ages. Gregory's response was equally dramatic. At his great Lenten Synod in Rome a month later, before a stunned audience, he calmly and formally excommunicated King Henry IV. He declared him stripped of his royal authority and, most devastatingly, released all of his Christian subjects from the sacred oaths of fealty they had sworn to him. The ultimate weapon had been deployed. The king was now, in the eyes of the church, an outlaw, and his kingdom was primed for rebellion. The Pope's decree of excommunication was not just a spiritual condemnation. It was a political nuclear bomb detonated in the heart of the German kingdom. The moment the news arrived, carried by breathless messengers over the Alps, Henry IV's power, which he had fought so hard to rebuild, simply dissolved. For the great dukes of Saxony, Swabia, and Bavaria, who had long resented the king's authority, this was a gift from heaven. Their rebellion was no longer a treasonous act. It was now a pious duty, sanctioned by the Vicar of Christ himself. All the simmering resentments over the king's use of low-born ministeriales, his attempts to reclaim ducal lands, his arrogant and stubborn personality, now burst into flame. In October of 1076, the German princes gathered at an assembly in Tribur. They put Henry on trial in absentia, and feeling the tide of power shift, his own German bishops, the very men who had condemned the Pope at Worms just months earlier, abandoned him. A terrible ultimatum was issued. Henry had 1 year and 1 day to free himself from the Pope's ban of excommunication. If he failed, the throne would be considered vacant, and the princes would proceed to elect a new king. They even invited Pope Gregory to come to Augsburg the following February to personally preside over the final judgment of their king. Henry felt the world shrink around him. He was isolated, abandoned, and trapped. His enemies had set a perfect snare. If he stayed in Germany, he would be a powerless outcast, waiting for the Pope and the princes to formally strip him of his crown. His only hope, a desperate and wildly dangerous one, was to preempt their plan. He had to get to the Pope himself, force a meeting, and secure absolution before Gregory could cross the Alps and join with his German enemies. But there was a problem. It was December. The Alpine passes were choked with snow and ice, considered impassable for any army, let alone a royal entourage. But he had no choice. With his loyal wife, Bertha, their infant son Conrad, and only a handful of followers, Henry set out on a journey that no one thought possible. He took the route over the Mont-Cenis Pass, a treacherous path in the best of times. I can feel the biting wind, a constant, razor-sharp gale that cut through their cloaks and chilled them to the bone. The cold was so intense that the local guides they hired had to kill their horses and use their hides as makeshift toboggans to slide the queen and her ladies-in-waiting down the sheer, ice-covered slopes. The king and his men, to keep their footing, were forced to crawl on their hands and knees. It was a terrifying, miserable, and utterly desperate scramble over the roof of the world. When Henry finally descended into the plains of Lombardy in northern Italy, he was met with a surge of support from the local bishops and nobles who loathed Pope Gregory and his reforms. But Henry wasn't there to raise an army. He was on a different mission. He learned that the Pope, hearing of the king's approach, had halted his own journey north and taken refuge in the most secure place imaginable, the fortress of Canossa. It was the mountain stronghold of his most powerful ally, the formidable Countess Matilda of Tuscany. The castle sat perched on a massive, sheer-sided rock, its walls and towers seeming to grow out of the stone itself, a grim, unbreachable sanctuary. It was, Henry must have thought with a sinking heart, the perfect place for an enemy to wait. On the morning of January 25th, 1077, King Henry IV, the most powerful secular ruler in Christendom, arrived before the gates of Canossa. He did not arrive with an army or in the splendor of his office. He came as a penitent. He had cast off all signs of royalty and wore only a simple, scratchy tunic of rough, undyed wool. He was barefoot. He stood in the snow before the outer gate of the castle, his head bowed, and he waited. All day he stood there as the snow fell, and the cold gnawed at him. The gates remained shut. A second day passed in the same way. Henry, the descendant of Otto the Great, stood shivering in the castle courtyard, a spectacle of royal misery. And then a third day. This was a breathtaking piece of political theater, an act of public abasement on a scale never seen before. It was the ultimate performance of humility, designed to force the Pope's hand. It was like a modern chief executive facing total corporate ruin, issuing the most groveling, tear-filled public apology imaginable. Inside the castle walls, Gregory VII was facing his own crisis. I can feel his torment, a conflict that pitted his political instincts against his priestly duty. As a political strategist, he knew Henry's penance was a calculated move. His best strategy was to let Henry freeze, to let the deadline expire, and to travel to Germany to oversee the election of a new, more compliant king. But as a priest, he was trapped. The laws of the church were clear. Any sinner who comes with a contrite heart, performs penance, and begs for forgiveness must be forgiven. To refuse absolution to a penitent standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days would be an act of monstrous spiritual pride, a betrayal of his sacred office. The two other powerful figures in the castle, Countess Matilda and the great Abbot Hugh of Cluny, who was Henry's godfather, pleaded with the Pope, acting as intermediaries. Finally, on the 4th day, Gregory relented. The inner gates swung open. Henry was brought before the Pope, weeping, and he threw himself on the floor. Gregory, perhaps with tears in his own eyes, lifted him up, removed the ban of excommunication, and the two men, the great rivals, shared communion at Mass. On the surface, Henry had won. He had his forgiveness. He had shattered the plans of the German rebels. He could return to his kingdom and fight for his crown. But the price was immense, and historians still argue whether Canossa was a brilliant, pragmatic move that saved Henry's crown, or the ultimate humiliation of secular power before the church. The image of the emperor, God's anointed ruler on earth, begging for 3 days in the snow before the Pope, was a symbol of such staggering power that it could never be erased. The world had been turned upside down, and though the fight was far from over, the fundamental relationship between kings and popes had been changed forever. The dramatic scene at Canossa, with the weeping king and the forgiving pope, felt like an ending, but it was merely the end of the first act. The peace it created was a mirage, lasting only as long as it took for the snows to melt. Henry IV believed that by receiving absolution, he was fully restored as king, his rights intact. Pope Gregory VII, however, saw things very differently. He had forgiven Henry the sinner, but he had not necessarily restored the authority of Henry the king. The German princes, furious that Henry had slipped their trap, decided to ignore the absolution entirely. In March 1077, just 2 months after Canossa, they gathered and proceeded with their plan, electing their own king, Duke Rudolph of Swabia. The Pope, in a masterful display of political maneuvering, remained neutral, waiting to see which side would emerge victorious. The walk to Canossa had not brought peace. It had simply guaranteed a long and brutal civil war. For the next decade, Germany bled. The conflict was not one of great, decisive battles, but a grinding, miserable affair of sieges, raids, and counter-raids. It was a war that tore the fabric of the kingdom apart, pitting bishop against bishop, prince against prince, and sometimes father against son. Castles were burned, fields were ravaged, and a deep uncertainty settled over the land. Henry IV, for all his faults, was a tough, resilient, and skilled military commander. He weathered the storm of rebellion, fighting tirelessly to reclaim his kingdom town by town. In 1080, in a battle in Thuringia, the anti-king Rudolph of Swabia was mortally wounded. In a moment rich with medieval symbolism, he lost his right hand in the fighting, the very hand upon which he had sworn his sacred oath of loyalty to King Henry. He is said to have looked at the stump and lamented that he had been rightly punished for his perjury. The rebellion in Germany began to crumble, but the wider war continued unabated. An enraged Pope Gregory excommunicated Henry for a second time. This time, however, the German people were weary of the conflict, and the excommunication had far less impact. Henry, now secure in Germany and master of northern Italy, decided to take the fight to the Pope himself. He marched his army on Rome, and after a long siege, captured the city in 1084. He drove his great adversary, Gregory VII, into exile in the south of Italy. Gregory, the brilliant, unbending revolutionary, died a year later, a seemingly broken man, famously uttering the bitter words, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." With his enemy gone, Henry completed his triumph by installing his own pope in Rome, who took the name Clement III. Now Christendom was thoroughly fractured. In many parts of Europe, there was a pope and an anti-pope, a king and an anti-king. It must have been a terribly confusing time, trying to figure out which holy man to listen to and which tax collector to pay. It was a stalemate written in blood and sealed with anathemas. The struggle was so long and bitter that it outlived its original combatants. As the years turned into decades, Henry Thought grew old, a man worn down by a lifetime of constant warfare. He had never known a single year of true peace, and in the end, the cruelest blow came not from a pope or a rebellious duke, but from his own family. His second son, also named Henry, saw that his father's endless, stubborn war was leading the dynasty to ruin. The German princes, ever eager to weaken the crown, saw their opportunity in this ambitious young man. In a cynical betrayal, the young Henry, who would become Henry IV, made an alliance with his father's enemies, the reformist papacy and the German princes, and launched a rebellion. In 1105, he lured his aging father into a trap, promising a reconciliation. Instead, he had the old king seized, imprisoned in a castle, and under immense pressure, forced him to abdicate the throne. Henry IV, the man who had survived Canossa and driven a pope from Rome, managed one last, desperate escape. He tried to rally support to reclaim his crown, but he died the following year, a broken and betrayed figure, still under the ban of the church he had fought for so long. Once he had secured the crown, Henry IV proved that the apple does not fall far from the tree. Having won the throne as a champion of the papal reformers, he immediately abandoned them and proved to be just as ruthless and determined as his father to maintain control over the German church. In 1111, he marched an army to Rome to demand his imperial coronation. When the Pope, Pascal II, refused to grant it without concessions on the issue of investiture, Henry IV did something his father had never dared. He simply had the Pope and the entire College of Cardinals arrested, holding them hostage until the terrified pontiff gave in to all his demands. This act of brute force shocked Christendom. It proved that the conflict was not simply about the personalities of Gregory and Henry IV. It was a fundamental clash over the nature of power in a Christian society. But by this point, after nearly 50 years of division and war, both sides were exhausted. The endless conflict was devastating Germany and undermining the moral authority of the church. A new generation of leaders, men who had not lived through the fiery zeal of the 1070s, began to look for a practical compromise. Finally, in the German city of Worms in the year 1122, legates of the Pope and representatives of the Emperor hammered out a lasting agreement. The Concordat of Worms was a masterpiece of medieval legal compromise. It drew a crucial distinction between a bishop's two roles. The Emperor, Henry IV, agreed to give up the right to invest bishops with the symbols of their spiritual office, the ring and the crooked staff, or crozier. This was a major victory for the Church's claim to spiritual independence. In return, the Pope agreed that the election of bishops would take place in the Emperor's presence, and that the Emperor would invest the new bishop with the lands and secular authority of his office by touching him with a royal scepter. This ensured that the bishops remained the Emperor's feudal vassals. It was a clever solution that allowed both sides to claim victory. The great investiture controversy was finally over. The fighting stopped, the excommunications were lifted, and an uneasy peace settled over the empire. The hard-won compromise at Worms brought an end to the open warfare, but it did not heal the wounds of the kingdom. The 50-year struggle between Pope and Emperor had fundamentally and permanently changed the nature of German politics. The real winners were not the popes nor the emperors, but the great German princes. By siding with or against the king, by playing one side of the other, they had grown immensely powerful. So when the last Salian emperor, Henry IV, died without a son in 1125, the princes gathered for the royal election with a newfound sense of their own importance. The old idea of a divinely ordained hereditary dynasty was broken. Now, they felt, the crown was truly theirs to give. They seemed to quite enjoy the feeling, realizing that an election was a perfect opportunity to extract promises and concessions from any potential candidate. It was the birth of the deeply rooted German elective monarchy, a system that would prevent the centralization of power for the next 600 years. The most obvious candidate in 1125 was Henry IV's nephew, Frederick of Hohenstaufen, the powerful Duke of Swabia. But the princes, especially the great archbishops, feared a seamless continuation of the powerful Salian line. They wanted a king they could control. So, in a deliberate political maneuver, they passed over the powerful Hohenstaufen and instead chose a man who was older, had no royal blood, and was a traditional rival of the Salian house, Lothair, the Duke of Saxony. It was a clear statement that the princes were now the kingmakers. Lothair's election immediately plunged the kingdom back into strife. The slighted Hohenstaufen family, who controlled the old Salian lands, refused to recognize him and launched a decade-long rebellion. To defend his throne, King Lothair made a fateful alliance. He married his only child and heiress, Gertrude, to the most powerful and ambitious prince in the entire empire, Henry the Proud, the Duke of Bavaria, from the Welf family. Through this marriage, Henry the Proud would eventually control two of the greatest duchies, Saxony and Bavaria, creating a personal domain that rivaled and even surpassed that of the king himself. This was the spark that ignited the greatest political feud of medieval Germany, a rivalry that would last for a century. From this point on, German politics became a bitter struggle between two mighty factions, the Hohenstaufen of Swabia and their supporters, and the Welbs of Bavaria and Saxony. It was a feud that would even spill into Italy, where the two sides became known by their Italian names, the Ghibellines and the Guelphs. When Lothair died in 1137, the princes were faced with a terrifying prospect: the succession of the impossibly powerful Welf Duke, Henry the Proud. Fearing the creation of a Welf superstate, they performed another political pirouette. They met in a hurry and, ignoring the Welf claim, elected the very man they had snubbed last time, the Hohenstaufen leader, Conrad, who became King Conrad III. His reign was almost a complete failure. He spent nearly all of his 15 years on the throne in an exhausting and inconclusive civil war against Henry the Proud, and later his equally formidable son, Henry the Lion. The royal authority, which had been so absolute under Henry III, now seemed like a distant memory. The king had little control over the great princes, who acted like independent sovereigns, Conrad's one great foreign policy venture. His participation in the ill-fated Second Crusade was a military and financial disaster that only further weakened his prestige at home. Germany was paralyzed, caught in the grip of the seemingly endless Welf-Hohenstaufen feud. As he lay dying in 1152, Conrad III recognized that the kingdom was on the verge of collapse. He knew his own 6-year-old son was not the answer. The kingdom needed a leader who could command respect, unite the factions, and restore the honor of the crown. In a moment of supreme clarity, he bypassed his son and recommended his nephew for the throne. This was the 30-year-old Duke of Swabia, a man with a unique political pedigree that made him the perfect compromise candidate. His father was a Hohenstaufen, but his mother was a Welf. He was, in a very real sense, a product of both warring houses. His name was Frederick. The princes, weary of decades of infighting, agreed. At his election in Frankfurt, a chronicler noted that a new hope had dawned on the realm. The new king was a man who seemed born to the role. Frederick III was a striking figure, strong, charismatic, and sporting the magnificent red gold beard that would earn him his Italian nickname, Barbarossa. He was the perfect embodiment of the new age of chivalry, a skilled knight and a man with a profound sense of his own destiny. He looked back with nostalgia to the reigns of Charlemagne and Otto the Great, and felt a deep, burning desire to restore the empire to its former glory. The central concept of his reign was the honor imperii, the honor of the empire. To him, this meant two things. First, he had to establish a lasting peace, a Landfrieden within Germany itself, forcing the great princes to stop their private wars and submit to royal justice. Second, and far more importantly in his mind, he had to reassert imperial authority over the one part of the empire that had slipped almost completely from German control, the Kingdom of Italy. For Barbarossa, Italy was the key to everything. After decades of civil war, the German kings had lost control of many of the royal lands and revenues north of the Alps. Their power base at home was weak. The real wealth of the empire now lay in the south, in the bustling, prosperous city-states of Lombardy. Cities like Milan, Pavia, and Cremona had taken advantage of the long German absence to become fabulously wealthy through trade and manufacturing. They governed themselves as independent republics, fighting wars against each other and acknowledging the emperor's authority with little more than a polite nod. Barbarossa felt that this was an intolerable affront to the honor imperii. These cities and their immense wealth were his by ancient right. To restore the empire, he had to become their master, and so, with a vision of Charlemagne in his mind and a firm belief in his sacred rights, Frederick Barbarossa, the red-bearded king, gathered his army of German knights and pointed them south across the Alps, on a collision course with the proud and wealthy communes of Italy. Frederick Barbarossa's army of German knights, descending from the Alpine passes in 1154, must have felt like they were entering a new world. They came from a land of forests, castles, and a society built on the bonds of feudal loyalty between lord and vassal. Lombardy, however, was a land of cities. It was a bustling, crowded, and incredibly noisy landscape of stone towers, paved streets, and merchant palaces, a place where the air was thick with the scent of commerce, and where power was held not by landed nobles, but by councils of merchants and lawyers. Barbarossa, with his high-minded ideals of imperial authority, was immediately offended by the proud and independent spirit of these communes. They behaved, he felt, like insolent subjects who had forgotten their master. He began his reign in Italy as a stern judge, listening to complaints from smaller cities against the bullying of the powerful and arrogant Milan. He made an example of Milan's ally, the city of Tortona, besieging it, and after its surrender, razing it to the ground. He then continued to Rome, where he was formally crowned emperor. But even this was soured by a bloody riot between the German soldiers and the Roman populace, a grim preview of the relationship to come. His vision for Italy was fully and fatefully revealed on his second, much larger expedition in 1158. On the plains near Piacenza, he convened a massive imperial assembly, the Diet of Roncaglia. This was to be no mere meeting of nobles. This was a legal revolution. Frederick had brought with him 4 famous jurists from the great law school at Bologna, men who had spent their lives studying the just rediscovered code of ancient Roman law, standing before the assembled bishops, princes, and city representatives. These lawyers laid out a new and breathtaking definition of imperial power based on Roman precedent. All sovereign rights, they declared, the regalia, belonged to the emperor alone. This included the right to levy tolls on roads and rivers, to mint coinage, to collect taxes, and to appoint all dukes, counts, and city magistrates. A city could only exercise these rights if it could produce an imperial charter specifically granting them. It was a legal bombshell. For generations, the cities had simply assumed these rights for themselves. Now, the emperor was declaring their self-government illegal and demanding that the fire hose of wealth that flowed from Italian commerce be redirected from the city halls into his own imperial treasury. The city of Milan, the wealthiest and most powerful of them all, became the center of defiance. For the Milanese, the decrees of Roncaglia were nothing less than a death sentence for their liberty. They refused to submit, and the result was a long and brutal war that culminated in a great siege. In 1162, after months of starvation and bombardment, Milan finally surrendered. Frederick's vengeance was terrible and theatrical. He ordered the city's walls, its towers, and nearly all its buildings to be systematically demolished. The citizens were forcibly dispersed into rural villages, and he is said to have had salt plowed into the ruins. It was an act of annihilation designed to be a lesson to all of Italy. This is the price of defying the emperor. For a time, it seemed to have worked. A wave of terror swept through Lombardy, and the cities grudgingly submitted to the harsh rule of Frederick's imperial governors. But this triumph of terror was short-lived. Frederick had underestimated the deep-rooted civic pride and resilience of the communes. His brutality created something that centuries of intercity warfare had never managed: a sense of shared Italian identity. It's a recurring theme in history. Nothing unites a group of perpetually squabbling neighbors faster than a common enemy showing up and telling everyone what to do. In 1167, the cities of Lombardy, including many that had previously been rivals of Milan, secretly bound themselves together in a military alliance sworn at Pontida. This was the Lombard League. They pledged to support each other and to fight to the death to restore their traditional liberties. With the quiet encouragement of the Pope, who also feared Frederick's power, the League became a formidable center of resistance. In a stunning act of solidarity, their first joint project was to rebuild the destroyed city of Milan, a powerful symbol of their defiance. The war now entered a new and frustrating phase for Barbarossa. He was no longer fighting individual cities, that he could pick off one by one, but a coordinated and determined confederation. Years were consumed in a series of exhausting and expensive campaigns that yielded no decisive victory. The final crisis came in 1176. Frederick was in Lombardy with a relatively small force, awaiting crucial reinforcements from across the Alps. He appealed to the most powerful prince in Germany, his cousin and rival, the Welf Duke Henry the Lion, to whom he had granted vast lands and power. At a meeting in the Alpine pass of Chiavenna, Frederick, in an astonishing gesture, is said to have knelt before his vassal, begging him for the troops he needed to save the imperial cause. Henry, sensing a chance to wring more concessions from the emperor, coldly refused. It was a catastrophic betrayal that left Barbarossa dangerously exposed. With the small army he had, Frederick marched to confront the main army of the Lombard League, which intercepted him near the small town of Legnano. The imperial army was what everyone in Europe considered the ultimate military weapon, a force of heavily armored professional knights. The League's army was something new and untested, a militia of tradesmen, merchants, and artisans, mostly fighting on foot. Their spiritual and tactical center was a great ox-drawn war wagon called the Carroccio, bearing the crucifix and the city's standard, a rallying point from which they would not retreat. The battle began as expected. The charge of the German knights was a thunderous, seemingly unstoppable force. It smashed into the Italian cavalry and drove them from the field. The knights then wheeled and crashed into the Lombard infantry. The line buckled, but around the Carroccio, it did not break. In the swirling, desperate melee, the emperor himself was unhorsed and vanished from sight. A rumor flashed through the German ranks. Barbarossa was dead. Panic set in. The leaderless imperial army disintegrated, and the rout was total. It was a world-shaking victory for the League. The citizen army of infantry had defeated the finest chivalry of the age. Barbarossa, who had survived the battle, recognized the truth. His dream of subjugating Italy by force was over. The long war finally ended with the Peace of Constance in 1183. It was a compromise. The cities acknowledged his overarching imperial authority, but he, in turn, had to grant them nearly everything they had fought for: the right to their own laws, their own officials, and their own finances. The honor of the empire had been saved in name, but in reality, the proud communes of Lombardy had won their freedom. Having accepted the hard reality of his defeat in Italy, a wiser and more pragmatic Frederick Barbarossa returned to Germany with a long memory and a score to settle. His gaze fell upon his powerful cousin, Henry the Lion, the Welf Duke, whose betrayal at Chiavenna had sealed his fate at Legnano. But Barbarossa did not move against him with an army. Instead, he used the weapon he had honed over his long reign: the law. He summoned Henry to appear before the imperial court to answer for his insubordination. When the proud duke refused to appear, he was tried in absentia, a panel of princes finding him guilty of treason. With the full weight of imperial law behind him, Barbarossa declared all of Henry's lands and titles forfeit. It was a political masterstroke. The other German princes, jealous of the Welf's immense power, eagerly joined in the legal dismantling of his domains. The great duchies of Bavaria and Saxony were carved up, with the emperor keeping some lands for himself and distributing the rest to other loyal nobles. Henry the Lion was left with only a fraction of his ancestral lands and was forced into a temporary exile in England. The mighty wealth power that had dominated Germany for a generation was shattered, with peace finally established in both Germany and Italy. The aging emperor, now in his 60s, embarked on his final and grandest adventure. He was the most respected monarch in Christendom, an elder statesman of immense prestige. When the shocking news arrived in Europe that Jerusalem had fallen to the great Muslim Sultan, Saladin, a call went out for a new crusade. It is one of history's gentle ironies that Barbarossa, a man who had spent decades fighting against the Pope and being excommunicated, now became the greatest champion of the Christian cause. He took the cross, vowing to lead an army to the Holy Land himself. In 1189, a massive and superbly organized German army, perhaps the largest of all the crusading forces, set out on the arduous overland route across the Balkans and Anatolia. Barbarossa maintained iron discipline, and the expedition proceeded with a success that eluded the other crusading parties. It seemed as if the great emperor was destined for one last glorious triumph. But his story was to end not with a bang, but with a strange and tragic accident. In June of 1190, while crossing the Salef River in what is now southern Turkey, the emperor, for reasons that are still debated, fell from his horse into the cold water. The weight of his armor may have dragged him down, or the shock of the cold water on a hot day may have caused a heart attack. Whatever the cause, Frederick Barbarossa, the Redbeard, the hero of the empire, drowned in a shallow river. The effect on his army was devastating. Leaderless and demoralized, the great German crusade fell apart. Most of the knights turned back, and only a small fraction ever reached the Holy Land. But a legend was born. The German people could not accept such a mundane end for their great hero. A myth grew that Barbarossa was not truly dead, but was merely sleeping in a cave deep within the Kyffhäuser mountain, his red beard growing through a stone table, waiting for the ravens to stop circling, at which point he would return to restore the empire to glory in its hour of greatest need. The imperial crown passed to his son, Henry VI, a man who possessed all his father's ambition, but none of his chivalrous charm. Henry was cold, calculating, and relentlessly efficient. His greatest triumph was the result of a brilliant dynastic marriage his father had arranged for him. He was married to Constance, the aunt and heiress of the King of Sicily. The Norman Kingdom of Sicily was not just the island. It was a vast and fantastically wealthy realm that included all of southern Italy. It boasted a strong, centralized government, a powerful navy, and a vibrant, multicultural society of Normans, Italians, Greeks, and Arabs. It was, quite simply, one of the richest prizes in all of Europe. When the Sicilian king died without a direct heir, Henry marched south to claim his wife's inheritance. After a brief but brutal campaign to crush all resistance, he was crowned King of Sicily in the magnificent cathedral at Palermo on Christmas Day, 1194. This union of Sicily and the German Empire was a geopolitical earthquake that terrified the papacy. The Papal States, the Pope's own territory in central Italy, were now squeezed in a vice, encircled by the lands of a single, powerful Hohenstaufen emperor. It was the papacy's worst nightmare come to life. Henry VI had even grander plans. He dreamed of making the imperial crown hereditary in his family and of launching a new, even larger crusade to conquer the Byzantine Empire. But his meteoric career was cut short. In 1197, he died of malaria in Sicily, aged just 32. His sudden death created an instant power vacuum. His heir was his son, Frederick, a boy of just 3, while the German princes predictably ignored the child king and fell back into their old Welf versus Hohenstaufen civil war, electing two rival kings. The young Frederick was left behind in Italy, an orphan king in a dangerous land. He grew up as a ward of the Pope, who was his nominal guardian, in the chaotic, vibrant, sun-drenched city of Palermo. It was an upbringing unlike that of any medieval monarch before him. Palermo was a cultural melting pot, where Latin, Greek, and Arabic were spoken in the streets, and where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars debated in the court. Frederick grew up not as a German prince in a cold, dark castle, but as a child of the Mediterranean, his mind shaped by the diverse cultures around him. He was fluent in multiple languages, intellectually curious, and fascinated by science, poetry, and philosophy. This strange, brilliant, Sicilian-raised boy, who preferred studying falcons to jousting with knights, would one day return to Germany to claim the throne of his grandfather, Barbarossa. He would be crowned Emperor Frederick II, and his unique, un-medieval mind would so dazzle and horrify his contemporaries that they would give him a title of awe and suspicion, Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. While the great Hohenstaufen emperors like Barbarossa and Henry VI were consumed by the grand, glittering prize of Italy, a very different story was unfolding along the empire's long eastern border. This was a story not of emperors and popes, nor of great battles and imperial diets, but of countless, nameless people. It was a slow, deep, and powerful current of migration, a movement of settlers, plows, and axes that would, over the course of 2 centuries, fundamentally remake the map of Germany and Central Europe. This great eastward expansion, known as the Ostsiedlung, was in many ways more lasting in its impact than all the glorious and bloody Italian campaigns combined. The frontier of the German-speaking world in the 12th century lay roughly along the Elbe and Saale rivers. To the east of this line was a vast and sparsely populated land of immense forests, tangled swamps, and sandy plains. This was not an empty wilderness. It was the home of numerous Slavic and Baltic tribes, peoples the Germans often lumped together under the name Wends. For centuries, this had been a porous border, a region of intermittent warfare, cautious trade, and the slow creep of the missionaries. But now, a massive wave of change was coming, driven by powerful forces from both west and east. The push came from within old Germany itself. By the 1100s, the lands west of the Elbe were experiencing a population boom. Several generations of relative stability and improved farming methods had led to a simple problem. There were too many people for the available land. The great forests had largely been cleared, and ancient inheritance customs often meant that younger sons were left with little or no property, facing a future as landless laborers. There was a palpable feeling of being crowded, a hunger for new opportunities and a new life that the old lands could no longer offer. At the same time, A powerful pull was being exerted from the east, the local Slavic lords, as well as the German princes on the frontier. Men like Albert the Bear in Brandenburg and the Great Welf, Henry the Lion in Saxony, saw their vast, underpopulated eastern territories not as wastelands, but as a massive economic opportunity. They wanted to make their lands more profitable, to increase their tax revenues and military power. To do that, they needed people, specifically people with the skills to clear dense forests and drain unproductive marshland. They began an aggressive recruitment drive. The key figure in this process was a type of medieval entrepreneur called a locator or locator. He was a settlement contractor, a middleman who bridged the gap between the prince who had the land and the peasants who needed it. A locator, often a lesser knight or a wealthy burgher, would receive a charter from a lord granting him a tract of wilderness to develop. He would then travel back to the crowded regions of Flanders, the Rhineland, or Westphalia, acting as a one-man advertising agency for the new frontier. He would offer prospective colonists an incredible deal, a contract that must have sounded too good to be true. Larger parcels of land than they could ever dream of at home, freedom from the burdensome services of serfdom, fixed and predictable rents, and even the right to their own village court and local priest. Having gathered his group of settlers, the locator would lead them east, survey the land, and using a measuring rope and stakes, lay out a brand new, rationally planned village. The physical labor involved was immense. I can feel the rhythm of the axe, the bite of iron into ancient oak and pine, as whole families worked to clear the primeval forest, tree by tree. The air would have been thick with the smell of wood smoke as they burned the stumps and undergrowth to prepare the soil for the plow. In the marshy river valleys, they worked together to dig miles of drainage ditches, using Dutch techniques to turn mosquito-infested swamps into lush, fertile pasture land. The new villages they built looked nothing like the organic, jumbled hamlets of old Germany. They were orderly and planned, often laid out as a Waldhufendorf, where each farmer had a long, narrow strip of land stretching from the village road back into the forest, or as an Angerdorf, with the houses arranged neatly around a central village green. The church was a huge part of this process as well, particularly the Cistercian order of monks. Seeking solitude, they would establish monasteries in the deepest wilderness, and then, with unparalleled organization and discipline, clear the forests and drain the fens, creating massive, efficient farms that became centers of agricultural innovation. This whole vast movement, however, carries a deeply complex legacy. Historians still argue whether the Ostsiedlung was primarily a violent military conquest or a largely peaceful process of settlement and cultural assimilation. The truth is that it was both. There were certainly moments of extreme violence, like the bloody Wendish Crusade of 1147, which sought to forcibly convert or exterminate the pagan Slavic tribes. Many Slavic communities were undoubtedly conquered, killed, or pushed off their ancestral lands. Yet, in other areas, the process seems to have been more gradual and even cooperative, with German and Slavic villages existing side by side. Often, the Slavic peasants themselves saw the advantages of the new German plows and legal systems and voluntarily adopted them. leading to a slow process of cultural and linguistic fusion. Over 2 centuries, this tide of migration completely redrew the map. A vast new German-speaking territory was created, doubling the size of the German cultural area and pushing its boundaries hundreds of miles east to Pomerania, Silesia, and the edge of Prussia. This expansion was secured by the founding of hundreds of new towns, many of which would become great cities. Lübeck, the future queen of the Hanseatic League, Rostock and Stettin on the Baltic coast, and a small, walled trading post in the forests of Brandenburg that would one day be called Berlin. This was the true, lasting conquest of the German Middle Ages. The great eastward migration of German farmers and traders was largely a civilian movement, driven by land hunger and the prospect of a better life. But on the far northeastern frontier, along the cold shores of the Baltic Sea, the Ostsiedlung took on a much harder, more fanatical, and more military edge. This final phase of the expansion was spearheaded by one of the most remarkable and fearsome organizations of the Middle Ages, the Teutonic Knights. They were a military monastic order, a hybrid of monk and warrior that the Crusades had brought into being. Like the more famous Templars and Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They heard Mass every morning and lived a disciplined communal life. But their monastery was a barracks. Their prayers were said in armor, and their sacred duty was to wage holy war for the Christian faith. The order had been founded by German merchants during the siege of Acre in the Holy Land, initially to run a field hospital, but it soon evolved into a fighting force. After the initial excitement of the Crusades in the Holy Land had faded, the Teutonic Knights, as the newest and least wealthy of the military orders, found themselves in search of a mission. They were a solution looking for a problem. For a brief time, they were invited by the King of Hungary to fight pagan tribes on his eastern border. But they were so effective and so ambitious, building their own castles and acting like independent rulers, that the alarmed king kicked them out. Then, in 1226, an invitation arrived that would change their destiny forever. Duke Conrad of Mazovia, a Polish prince, was having a terrible time with his neighbors. These were the Old Prussians, a collection of fierce, pagan Baltic tribes who inhabited the dense forests and marshlands between Poland and the sea. They were a constant threat, their raids a source of terror along the Polish frontier. The Duke asked the knights to come and act as a buffer force, offering them a small territory as a base of operations. It was a classic case of being careful who you invite over for dinner, because they might just decide to stay and take over the whole house. The Grand Master of the Order at the time was a man of political genius named Hermann von Salza. He was not merely a soldier. He was a master diplomat and a close advisor to the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, the wonder of the world. Hermann von Salza had a vision far grander than simply serving as a Polish duke's border patrol. Before committing a single night, he secured a legal document that was a masterstroke of political foresight. From his friend Emperor Frederick II, he obtained the Golden Bull of Rimini. This imperial charter granted the Teutonic Order, in advance, absolute sovereign authority over all the lands they might conquer from the Prussians. They would hold this territory not as a vassal of Poland or anyone else, but as a sovereign principality. owing allegiance only to the ultimate authorities of Christendom, the Pope, and the Holy Roman Emperor. It was a license to create a state. With their legal basis secure, the first handful of knights arrived on the banks of the Vistula River. Their appearance was stark and intimidating. They wore simple white mantles draped over their armor, emblazoned with a single, stark black cross. They were a small force, but they were disciplined, well equipped, and possessed by a cold, fanatical certainty in the righteousness of their cause. They were facing a formidable, if disunited, foe. The Prussian tribes fought with ferocious bravery to defend their homeland and their ancient faith, a paganism that venerated the spirits of nature in sacred, untouched groves of ancient oak trees. To the knights, these groves were demonic, and the people who worshipped in them were heathens who had to be converted or eliminated. The ensuing Prussian crusade was a 50-year-long war of incredible brutality and methodical conquest. The knights employed a slow, grinding, and terrifyingly effective strategy. They would advance along a river, build a primitive timber and earth fort, and use it as a base to launch raids deep into the surrounding territory. They would burn the Prussian villages, destroy their crops, and kill their warriors, a process of systematic terror designed to break the will to resist. Once an area was pacified, the real work began. The timber fort would be dismantled and replaced by a massive castle built of dark red brick, a permanent fortress that would dominate the landscape and serve as an administrative center. It was a strategy of methodical colonization, almost like a ruthless, modern corporation executing a hostile takeover of a new market, all under the banner of a holy mission. Over the decades, a chain of these imposing brick fortresses, culminating in the gigantic moated citadel of Marienburg, the Order's new capital, would rise from the Baltic plains. Behind the shield of the knight's swords came the German colonists, the farmers, artisans, and merchants who were the second wave of the conquest. The Order offered them land and protection, and in return, they populated the new towns and farms, creating the economic backbone of the new state. What emerged was a unique political entity, the Ordensstaat, the state of the Teutonic Order. It was a country run with the discipline of a monastery, the efficiency of a corporation, and the ruthlessness of a military dictatorship. It was governed entirely by the Knight Brothers of the Order, who controlled every aspect of life, from foreign trade in grain and amber to the administration of justice in the new German-style towns they founded, like Königsberg and Memel. They had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. They had conquered a country, wiped out or absorbed an entire culture, and in its place, built from scratch a powerful and wealthy German state on the Baltic coast, a new and formidable player in the politics of Northern Europe. While the great wave of the Ostsiedlung was permanently changing the German frontier, the imperial heartland was about to be consumed by the final, spectacular drama of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. We must now return to that strange boy king in Sicily, Frederick II, the wonder of the world. In 1212, as a teenager, he embarked on a perilous journey from his sun-drenched island over the Alps into the cold forests of Germany to claim the inheritance of his grandfather, Barbarossa. The throne was then held by a Welf emperor, Otto IV, But the young, charismatic Frederick, with the backing of the Pope and the King of France, quickly won the support of the German princes. He secured his crown, but he paid a staggering price for it. The prince's support was not free. More importantly, Frederick's heart was never in Germany. His true home and the center of his power was his efficiently run, wealthy kingdom of Sicily. His overwhelming desire was to return there, leaving Germany to be governed by his young son, Henry. To get the princes to agree to this, to elect his son as king, and effectively give him a free hand in Italy, Frederick II gave away the store. At an imperial diet in 1232, he issued a momentous charter, the Statutum in Favorem Principum, or Statute in Favor of the Princes. This was not just a minor concession. It was a constitutional revolution. The charter formally transferred a whole host of crucial sovereign rights from the emperor to the great secular princes. They were now legally entitled to control commerce, mint their own coins, build castles, and hold their own courts of justice within their territories. He was, in essence, bribing them with the powers of the crown, deliberately sacrificing his authority in Germany to free himself up to pursue his ambitions in Italy. He was sawing off the branch on which his grandfather had sat, and the princes happily handed him the saw. Frederick's reign was defined by his epic, generation-long struggle with the papacy. The popes, particularly the formidable lawyers Gregory IX and Innocent IV, were driven by a deep, existential fear. Looking at the map, they saw their own small state in central Italy, completely encircled by the lands of a single, brilliant, and powerful Hohenstaufen emperor. They were determined to destroy this viper's nest, and they used every weapon at their disposal. Frederick was excommunicated so many times, it almost became routine. The first major cause was his failure to immediately depart on a crusade he had vowed to lead. When he finally did go on crusade in the 1228, he did so in the most unorthodox way imaginable. He was, at the time, still under the ban of excommunication. He arrived in the Holy Land with only a small army, but he also brought with him his unique upbringing. This was an emperor who spoke Arabic, who understood and respected Islamic culture, and who preferred diplomacy to bloodshed. Instead of launching a frontal assault, he entered into direct negotiations with the sophisticated Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil. The two worldly, intelligent rulers, both connoisseurs of science and philosophy, found they had much in common and struck an astonishing deal. Without a single major battle, the Sultan agreed to hand over the holy city of Jerusalem, along with Bethlehem and Nazareth, to Frederick. It was one of the most successful crusades in history, achieving its primary goal through pure negotiation. But back in Europe, it was viewed with suspicion and horror. A crusade was supposed to be a holy war, not a real estate transaction between friends. It was so much less satisfying than a good, pious bloodbath. The Pope was so furious that he had declared Frederick deposed and even launched an invasion of his Italian kingdom, while the Emperor was away securing Jerusalem for Christendom. This set the tone for the rest of his life. Frederick's reign became a relentless, brutal war against the popes and their allies in the Lombard League. The propaganda was savage, with Pope Gregory Stein famously denouncing the emperor as the Antichrist. Frederick fought back with equal vigor, but the struggle consumed him and his resources. He died in his beloved Italy in 1250, the war still raging. The papacy was merciless in its goal to utterly exterminate the Hohenstaufen line. Frederick's son, Conrad IV, died just 4 years later. The Pope then offered the crown of Sicily to a French prince, Charles of Anjou, who invaded and conquered the kingdom. The last tragic act came in 1268, when Frederick's final heir, his 16-year-old grandson Conradin, tried to reclaim his inheritance, was defeated in battle, and was publicly beheaded in the main square of Naples. The great house of Hohenstaufen was extinct. With the death of the last emperor and his heirs, Germany, which had been neglected for decades, now fell into a complete power vacuum. The period from roughly 1254 to 1273 is known as the Great Interregnum, the time without a king. The German princes, now legal sovereigns in their own territories, had absolutely no desire to elect a strong ruler who might try to reclaim the powers they had won. Their solution was a farce. They elected foreigners, men with no lands or power base in Germany, who were willing to pay enormous bribes for the prestige of the royal title. It was like a bankrupt corporation appointing a couple of minor celebrities to the board. It looked nice on paper, but the regional managers were the ones with the real power, and they were busy looting the company. The two most notable phantom kings were an Englishman, Richard of Cornwall, and a Spaniard, Alfonso of Castile, neither of whom exercised any meaningful authority in the empire. In the absence of any central power, Germany descended into chaos. The era was governed by Faustrecht, literally fist law. It was a time when might made right. Robber knights, perched in their castles overlooking the Rhine, preyed on merchant caravans. Cities banded together into powerful leagues, like the Hanseatic League in the north, to protect their trade routes and administer their own justice. And the great princes, the dukes, margraves, and archbishops, acted as true kings, consolidating their territories, waging private wars, and building the foundations of the independent German states that would dominate the map for centuries to come. The dream of a unified empire, the vision of Barbarossa and Frederick II, seemed to have died forever. For 2 decades, the great German Empire had been a ship without a captain, adrift on a chaotic sea. The interregnum, the time without a king, had been a golden age for the most powerful princes, who solidified their independence. But for everyone else, it was a disaster. The reign of fist law meant that travel and trade were plagued by the constant threat of robber knights, and petty wars between local lords were an endless drain on the land and its people. This chronic instability was finally brought to a head by pressure from the one figure who still thought in universal terms, the Pope. Pope Gregory XI was desperate to organize a new crusade to the Holy Land, but he knew this was impossible without a recognized Holy Roman Emperor to lead it. He sent a stark ultimatum to the German archbishops: elect a king, or he would appoint one himself. This threat finally spurred the German princes into action. In the autumn of 1273, the 7 great prince-electors, the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg, met in the city of Frankfurt. Their shared goal was clear and profoundly self-interested. They needed a king strong enough to suppress the worst of the chaos and restore a basic level of peace. A king who could make the roads safe for commerce again. But they absolutely did not want another powerful, ambitious emperor in the mold of the Hohenstaufen, who would try to reclaim royal power, tax them, and drag them into costly wars in Italy. The perfect candidate would be someone respectable and competent, but not so powerful as to be a threat to their own hard-won sovereignty. The most powerful contender, King Ottokar II of Bohemia, a mighty ruler with a sprawling kingdom of his own, was immediately ruled out. He was exactly the kind of overmighty subject they feared. Instead, acting on the shrewd advice of the Archbishop of Mainz, they turned their attention to a surprise candidate. He was a 55-year-old count from the southwest corner of the empire, from a respectable but second-tier family with modest possessions scattered across Swabia and Alsace. His name was Rudolf of Habsburg. To the great electors, he seemed perfect. He was a proven military leader and a pious man, but his personal power base, his Hausmacht, was far too small to ever challenge their own. They thought they were electing a caretaker, a man who would politely manage the empire while leaving them in peace. It was one of the greatest political miscalculations of the Middle Ages. Rudolf was a new type of king for a new era. Tall and lanky, with a distinctively large aquiline nose, he was a man of immense personal charm, humility, and above all, a deep and abiding pragmatism. He had no romantic, universal visions of restoring the glory of the Caesars. He immediately and publicly renounced the Hohenstaufen dream of controlling Italy, a policy that had bled the kingdom dry for a century. His focus was on Germany, and his goals were practical: restore peace, rebuild the crown's finances, and most importantly, advance the interests of his own family. He was less interested in the grand title of Holy Roman Emperor than in being an effective king of Germany. And he understood that the key to power was not a fancy title, but land and money. He began by tackling the fist law, launching a series of campaigns across the kingdom, not against the great princes, but against the robber knights who had terrorized the countryside. He besieged over 70 of their castles, and when they were captured, he had the knights summarily hanged, making no distinction between noble and common-born criminals. This act of ruthless justice made him immensely popular with the cities and all who depended on trade. At the same time, he began a painstaking process of reclaiming the imperial estates and rights that had been illegally sold or seized during the interregnum. He was like a shrewd estate manager, carefully rebuilding the depleted asset portfolio of the crown. Rudolf's defining challenge, however, came from the man he had defeated in the election, King Ottokar II of Bohemia, the powerful ruler of a Slavic kingdom, who had also acquired the German duchies of Austria, Styria, and Carinthia during the interregnum, refused to recognize the pauper count Rudolf as his king. Rudolf, using the full authority of his new office, summoned Ottokar to the imperial diet to do homage for his lands. When Ottokar refused, Rudolf skillfully built a coalition of other German princes who were also wary of the Bohemian king's immense power. He placed Ottokar under the imperial ban, legally stripping him of all his titles and lands. The matter would be decided by war. On a hot August day in 1278, the two armies met on the vast flat plain of the Marchfeld near Vienna. It was one of the largest knightly battles of the century. Rudolf's clever tactics and the discipline of his German and Hungarian cavalry carried the day. Ottokar's army was routed, and the great Bohemian king was cut down and killed in the chaos. The victory gave Rudolf control over Ottokar's German duchies. And now, Rudolf showed his true genius. Any other king might have regranted these rich lands to another great noble. Rudolf, however, used his victory to establish a new and powerful territorial base for his own Habsburg family. He formally invested his own two sons, Alba and Rudolf, with the duchies of Austria and Styria. He was using his public office as king to secure a private, hereditary fortune for his dynasty. It was the single most important act of his reign, the founding moment of the Habsburg power base that would last for over 600 years and one day dominate Europe. This obscure Swabian count, chosen for his perceived weakness, had just played the Game of Thrones better than anyone and won his family the greatest prize on the board. Rudolf of Habsburg's death in the 1291 immediately revealed the new reality of German politics. The prince-electors, deeply wary of the powerful new Habsburg domain that Rudolf had built in Austria, were in no mood to create a hereditary monarchy. They deliberately ignored Rudolf's capable son, Alba, and instead reverted to their old strategy. They chose another pauper count, Adolf of Nassau, a man with little land and power of his own. The next few years dissolved into a messy struggle for the crown, which only ended when Albert of Habsburg, backed by a coalition of princes who had grown tired of Adolf, finally defeated and killed his rival in battle in the 1298. Albert III became king, but the point had been made. The crown was not an inheritance. It was a gift bestowed by the princes, and a gift they could take away, while these kings and princes wrestled for control of the increasingly hollow imperial title. A much more profound revolution was taking place behind the stone walls and fortified gates of Germany's growing cities. We must now turn our gaze away from the high politics of the court and into the crowded, chaotic, and vibrant streets of the medieval town. To step from the feudal countryside into a city like Cologne, Nuremberg, or Augsburg was to enter a different world. The air itself felt different, thick with the smoke of countless hearths and forges, the smell of leather, spices, and dung, and the ceaseless noise of hammering, shouting, and the ringing of 100 church and guild bells. The streets were a maze of narrow, unpaved alleys, twisting between tall, timber-framed houses, whose upper floors leaned out so far they nearly touched. But this cramped, often unsanitary world offered something that the feudal countryside did not. Freedom, an old German legal custom, captured in the famous saying, Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes you free, held that any serf who managed to live within a city's walls for a year and a day without being reclaimed by their lord was automatically considered a free man or woman. The city was a beacon of liberty, an island of commercial enterprise in a sea of aristocratic landholding. This freedom was not a given. It was won or bought through a long and often difficult struggle. Most towns began as a mere settlement under the thumb of a local feudal lord, usually a bishop or a powerful duke. This lord owned the land, appointed the officials, and collected all the taxes and tolls. But as the town's merchants and artisans grew wealthier, they also grew more confident and yearned to control their own affairs. This desire for self-government was the central political drama of urban life. The townspeople would pool their resources to buy a charter of liberties from a lord who was short on cash, and lords were always short on cash, especially if they had a crusade to fund or a private war to wage. Other times, freedom had to be fought for, with the newly formed citizen militia raising the drawbridge and defending their walls against the very lord who was supposed to be their protector. The resulting charter was the city's constitution and its declaration of independence, a precious parchment that guaranteed the citizens the right to elect their own council, run their own courts, and, most importantly, control their own finances. Life inside the walls was organized by the guilds. These were far more than simple trade associations. They were the fundamental building blocks of urban society. There was a guild for every conceivable craft: the weavers, the dyers, the goldsmiths, the armorers, the bakers, the butchers. The guilds were a combination of a cartel, a union, and a social club. They rigorously controlled their trade, setting standards for quality, fixing prices, and determining who could practice a craft. They trained apprentices, cared for the widows and orphans of their members, and celebrated feast days with boisterous processions. These guilds, especially the wealthy merchant guilds that controlled long-distance trade, came to dominate city politics. Their guild masters sitting on the town council and running the city like a business. The ultimate ambition for any truly successful city was to achieve the coveted status of Reichsfreiheit, or imperial immediacy. A town that was granted this status, like Lübeck, Frankfurt, or Regensburg, became an imperial free city, Reichsstadt. This meant it was legally cut loose from the authority of any local or regional lord. Its one and only overlord was the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Given that the emperor was usually weak, far away, and preoccupied with his own dynastic problems, this made the city a de facto independent republic. These city-states minted their own coins, raised their own armies, and engaged in their own diplomacy, becoming proud and sovereign players in the great game of German politics. Isolated and surrounded by the often hostile territory of feudal princes, the cities learned that there was strength in numbers. They began to form powerful defensive alliances. The most famous of these was the Great Hanseatic League in the north. But throughout Germany, cities banded together. The Swabian League and the Rhenish League could field armies of thousands of well-armed professional soldiers, and they were more than a match for the knightly host of any feudal prince. The world had been turned upside down. The landed aristocracy, who had for centuries looked down on the merchants as vulgar and lowly commoners, now found themselves having to negotiate with the powerful city leagues as equals. And, in a final irony, it was often the new money of the city bankers that the old money of the landed nobles turned to for the loans they needed to maintain their increasingly anachronistic lifestyle. A new power had undeniably arrived, while the cities of southern and western Germany banded together into leagues to defend their hard-won liberties from the princes who were their immediate neighbors. A far more ambitious and powerful association was taking shape along the cold, wind-swept coasts of the North and Baltic Seas. This was the Hanseatic League, or the Hansa, a commercial and defensive confederation that would, at its height, become the dominant economic and military power in all of Northern Europe. It was not an empire of land, but an empire of trade, built not by kings and knights, but by sober, calculating merchants in woolen robes. The origins of the Hansa are inseparable from the great eastward colonization, the Ostsiedlung. Its most powerful and influential members were the new German cities founded on the Baltic coast in the 12th and 13th centuries: Lübeck, Wismar, Rostock, Stralsund, Danzig, and others. These cities were perfectly positioned to act as a gateway, connecting the resource-rich, undeveloped hinterlands of Northern and Eastern Europe with the populous, manufacturing-heavy markets of the West. From its foundation in 1159, the city of Lübeck, with its strategic access to both the Baltic and North Seas, became the undisputed leader of this emerging network, the proud Queen of the Hansa. It was in the great Gothic town hall of Lübeck that the League's leaders would meet to set their common policy. But what was the Hansa? This is a question that is surprisingly difficult to answer precisely. It was never a formal state. For much of its history, it had no official membership list, no constitution, no permanent army, and no single head of state. The word Hansa was an old High German term for a guild, a convoy, or a troop. It was, in essence, a league of the merchant guilds from over 150 different towns, who all agreed to cooperate for their mutual profit and protection. Their leaders were not princes, but the town councillors and mayors of the member cities, men mockingly called Pfeffersäcke, or pepper sacks, by the landed aristocracy, a sneering reference to their supposedly vulgar profession. But these pepper sacks built a commercial network of staggering scale and sophistication. Their power rested on two pillars: the cog and the contour. The cog was the workhorse of Hanseatic trade. It was a stout, round-bellied, single-masted sailing ship, built for capacity rather than speed. Its high, clinker-built sides made it defensible against pirates, and its flat bottom allowed it to navigate shallow coastal waters. These ships, sailing in great organized convoys, were the container vessels of the 14th century, moving vast quantities of bulk goods across the northern seas. The Contora were the League's four major overseas trading posts, permanent, privileged, and often fortified merchant enclaves in foreign cities. There was the Steelyard in London, a walled compound on the banks of the Thames, the Peterhof in the Russian city of Novgorod, an isolated fortress in a hostile land, a major depot in Bruges, the great hub of the Flemish cloth trade, and the Briggen in Bergen, from which they monopolized the Norwegian stockfish trade. In these outposts, Hanseatic merchants lived under their own laws and their own aldermen, a state within a state. From these hubs, the League dominated the flow of commerce. The trade was a great circular river of goods. From the east came the raw materials of the north, immense quantities of timber and grain from Prussia and Poland, beeswax from the forests of Russia, essential for the candles of every church in Europe, and priceless furs, sable, ermine, and fox, to line the robes of the wealthy. From the west came the manufactured goods, fine Flemish cloth, barrels of French wine, and most importantly, salt from the great mines at Lüneburg, which was crucial for preserving the single most important commodity of the Baltic trade. That was, of course, herring. For a few weeks every autumn, the fish would swarm in the strait between Denmark and Sweden in such numbers that it was said you could dip a bucket in the water and pull it out half full of fish. The Hansa completely controlled the fishing, the salting, and the shipping of this vital source of protein for all of Northern Europe. The League's primary weapon was not the sword, but the balance sheet. When a foreign king or prince tried to curtail their privileges, impose a new tax, or seize their goods, the League's first response was a crushing trade embargo. They would collectively cease all trade with the offending port or kingdom. Since they controlled the vital supply of grain, salt, and timber, this could bring a kingdom's economy to its knees. And it was a weapon that almost always worked. It was the medieval equivalent of a massive multinational corporation using its control of the supply chain to dictate terms to a national government. When economic pressure failed, however, the Hansa was more than capable of waging war. Their greatest military test came in the 1360s, when King Valdemar IV of Denmark tried to break their stranglehold on the Baltic. He sacked the great Hanseatic trading center of Visby, a direct challenge to their power. The response was decisive. A confederation of Hanseatic cities, led by Lübeck, pooled their resources, built a massive war fleet, and declared war on the Kingdom of Denmark. They defeated the Danish fleet, blockaded their ports, and even captured and plundered Copenhagen. The war ended in 1370 with the Treaty of Stralsund, a complete and total victory for the League. The Danish king was forced to confirm all of the Hansa's trading privileges, grant them a 15% share of his kingdom's customs revenue, and, most humiliatingly, give the League a formal veto over the succession to the Danish throne. A confederation of merchants had brought one of Europe's oldest monarchies to its knees. For a time, the masters of the North were not kings or princes, but the sober, determined burghers of the Hanseatic League. The election of Rudolf of Habsburg had ended the chaos of the interregnum, but it had not solved the fundamental problem of the German monarchy. The crown was now a political football, tossed between a handful of powerful competing dynasties who had emerged from the wreckage of the Hohenstaufen Empire. For the next century, the throne would be occupied by a succession of Habsburgs from Austria, Wittelsbachs from Bavaria, and a newly powerful family, the House of Luxembourg, whose power base was the wealthy Kingdom of Bohemia. The princes had gotten what they wanted. The king was now a creature of their own making, and the elections were a perfect opportunity to bargain for more power and privilege. But these contested elections, often pitting a candidate from one great house against another, were themselves a source of profound instability, frequently leading to civil war between rival claimants. The man who would finally bring some order to this constitutional mess was one of the most remarkable rulers of the late Middle Ages, Charles IV. A member of the House of Luxembourg and King of Bohemia, Charles ascended to the German throne in 1347. He was not a warrior king like Barbarossa. He was a scholar, a patron of the arts, a devout Christian, and a shrewd, calculating diplomat who preferred negotiation to battle. He was a supreme realist. He knew that the old dream of a powerful, centralized German monarchy was dead and buried with the Hohenstaufen. Instead of wasting his energy trying to resurrect it, he focused on two more achievable goals. First, transforming his own hereditary kingdom of Bohemia into a powerful and prosperous state, and second, giving the deeply fractured German Empire a stable, workable constitution. He lavished his attention on his capital city of Prague, turning it into one of the most beautiful and intellectually vibrant cities in Europe. A new Rome, adorned with magnificent bridges, a new cathedral, and in 1348, the first university in Central Europe. Having secured his own power base, Charles turned his methodical mind to the problem of the empire. The root of the instability, he knew, was the process of the royal election itself. There were no clear written rules. No one was even entirely sure who had the right to vote. Whenever a king died, a messy argument would break out. Did the Duke of Saxe-Wittenberg or the Duke of Saxe-Lauenburg get to cast the single vote for Saxony? Did the King of Bohemia, a Slavic ruler, even have the right to vote for the King of the Germans? And looming over it all was the ghost of Canossa. The papacy still insisted that any election was invalid without the Pope's formal approval. This messy, ill-defined process was a recipe for disaster. In a series of imperial diets held in Nuremberg and Metz between 1355 and 1356, Charles IV, through masterful diplomacy, persuaded the princes of the realm to agree to a fundamental law that would settle these questions once and for all. The result was the most important constitutional document of the medieval empire, the Golden Bull of 1356, so named for the ornate golden seal, or bulla, that was affixed to the official copy. It was, in essence, the first written constitution of the Holy Roman Empire. The Golden Bull addressed the electoral chaos with methodical clarity. First, it definitively fixed the identity of the 7 prince-electors. No more arguments, no more rival claimants. The right to elect the King of the Germans was vested in 3 ecclesiastical lords, the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, and 4 secular lords, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, specifically the Saxe-Wittenberg line, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. Everyone else, no matter how powerful, was essentially being told that their invitation to the king-making party was permanently lost in the mail. Second, it declared that a simple majority of 4 votes was sufficient for a valid election, ending the problem of stalemates. Third, to prevent future family squabbles over the vote, it decreed that the secular electorates were indivisible and must be passed down whole to the eldest son. Most momentously, the document laid out the entire electoral process, from the moment a king died to the final counting of the votes, without a single mention of the Pope. This was a quiet but profound revolution. The election of the German king was now, by law, a purely German affair. The Pope's claim to approve or veto the result was simply ignored into oblivion. But the Golden Bull did more than just regulate the election. It redefined the empire itself. It granted the 7 electors near sovereign rights within their own territories. They were given the privilegium de non appellando, meaning their own supreme courts were the final courts of appeal, and no subject of theirs could appeal a case to the imperial court. They had the right to mint their own coinage, levy their own tolls, and hold their own assemblies. The electors were legally established as the pillars of the empire, a near equal partner to the emperor himself. Charles IV, the great pragmatist, had looked at the political reality of a Germany dominated by a handful of powerful princes and decided not to fight it, but to formalize it. He had created a stable and orderly system, but he did so by officially sanctioning the empire's fragmentation. The Golden Bull was the empire's new foundation, but it was the foundation for a very different kind of structure. Not the centralized monarchy of old, but a decentralized, aristocratic federation, a loose confederation of states co-ruled by an emperor, and an exclusive club of electors. This constitution would provide a fragile but lasting peace, and it would govern the Holy Roman Empire for the next 400 years. In the years following the Golden Bull of 1356, a fragile but real sense of order had settled over the German lands. Under the steady hand of Emperor Charles IV, the endless feuds of the princes were somewhat muted, and the empire, now a stable, decentralized confederation, seemed to have found its equilibrium. The great cities, secure in their liberties and growing wealthy from trade, were flourishing. The Hanseatic League dominated the northern seas. The towns of the Rhineland and Swabia were bustling centers of craft and commerce, and the silver mines of Bohemia poured wealth into the emperor's coffers. Life, for all its medieval hardships, had a predictable rhythm. The harvests came in, the trade fairs were held, and the great Gothic cathedrals, financed by urban pride, grew ever higher. It was a world that felt solid, a society that believed it understood its place in God's ordered universe. It had no idea that it was standing on the edge of a charnel house. The first whispers arrived with the merchants, trickling up from the great Italian port cities of Genoa and Venice. They were strange, terrifying rumors of a pestilence of almost unimaginable horror, a disease that had traveled from the depths of Asia along the Silk Road and had arrived in Europe on a fleet of Genoese trading ships fleeing a siege in the Crimea. They spoke of a sickness that struck with the speed of lightning, that covered the body in black sores and strange, painful swellings, and that killed almost everyone who contracted it within a matter of days. In Germany, these stories were heard with a shudder of distant fear, the kind of horror that always happens somewhere else, to someone else. Then, in late 1348, it stopped being a story. The Black Death arrived. It did not sweep over the land in a single, uniform wave, but crept insidiously along the arteries of trade that gave Germany its lifeblood. It moved up the Rhine from the Low Countries. It came over the Alpine passes with the caravans from Italy, and it sailed into the Hanseatic ports on the cogs returning from their contouré abroad. The symptoms were terrifyingly consistent. First came a sudden fever and shivering, followed by excruciating pain. Then came the defining sign, the one that brought a sentence of death, the appearance of the buboes, hard, swollen, and agonizingly tender lumps in the lymph nodes of the groin, the armpits, or the neck. In the final stages, the victim's skin would often darken from subcutaneous hemorrhages, giving the disease its dreadful name. From the first sign of fever to the final breath, it was often less than a week. What followed was the greatest demographic catastrophe in European history. The sheer scale of the dying is almost impossible to comprehend. I can feel the rhythm of a town's life breaking down. At first, the church bells tolled for every death, their mournful sound a constant backdrop to daily life. Then, as the sextons and the bell ringers themselves began to die, the bells fell silent. The social fabric, woven from threads of family, duty, and faith, simply disintegrated. People locked themselves in their houses, terrified of the very air they breathed. Parents abandoned sick children. Husbands and wives turned away from each other. Priests, heroic at first, began to refuse to administer the last rites for fear of infection. The dead accumulated so quickly that normal burials became impossible. At night, death carts would creak through the silent streets, their drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead." The bodies were then taken to vast, hastily dug plague pits on the edge of town and dumped in, unmourned and unblessed. It felt like the apocalypse. God, it seemed, had turned his face away from the world. In the face of this incomprehensible horror, people searched desperately for a reason. Why was this happening? Many believed it was a divine punishment for the sins of mankind. But for a terrified populace, an abstract sin was not a satisfying answer. They needed a culprit, a human agent for this divine wrath. And so, one of the most vicious and shameful chapters in German medieval history began. A conspiracy theory, born of fear and ancient prejudice, spread like the plague itself. The Jews, it was said, had caused the pestilence by poisoning the wells. This accusation, utterly baseless and irrational, ignited a firestorm of persecution. Across the Rhineland and throughout the German-speaking world, horrific pogroms were unleashed. Often, the massacres would happen even before the plague had reached the city, driven by a panicked hysteria. In February 1349, in the city of Strasbourg, the city's entire Jewish population of over 900 people was rounded up, dragged to the Jewish cemetery, and burned alive on a massive wooden platform. Similar atrocities occurred in Mainz, Cologne, Erfurt, and dozens of other towns. The communities that had existed for centuries were, in the space of a few months, almost completely annihilated. Another equally strange reaction to the overwhelming fear was the flagellant movement. Great processions of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people would march from town to town, dressed in white robes marked with a red cross. They would enter a town's market square and arrange themselves in a large circle. Then, to the sound of mournful hymns, they would begin to publicly whip themselves and each other with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes. A bloody and theatrical spectacle of public penance designed to atone for the world's sins and turn away God's anger. While initially seen as a sign of piety, the movement soon became a destabilizing force, challenging the authority of the church and often inciting the very massacres of Jews that were already tearing society apart. When the first great wave of the plague finally burned itself out around 1351, a deep, exhausted silence fell over a changed world. It was a much emptier world. Historians estimate that in those few short years, Germany lost at least a third of its population. The psychological trauma was immense. The old stable world of the mid-14th century was gone forever, shattered by a microscopic organism and the human terror it had unleashed. The experience left a deep and lasting scar, a darkness that would haunt the art, the religion, and the social memory of Germany for a century to come. The world after the Black Death was a world unmoored. The immense trauma of the Great Dying left behind a society haunted by death and obsessed with salvation. This produced a current of intense, sometimes hysterical piety, and a profound dissatisfaction with the leadership of the Church, which had offered no comfort or explanation during the catastrophe. This crisis of faith was made infinitely worse when the Church, the very institution meant to be a rock of stability, proceeded to tear itself apart. In 1378, a disputed papal election led to the calamity known as the Great Western Schism. Two popes were elected, one in Rome and one in Avignon, France. Both claimed to be the one true vicar of Christ, and both excommunicated the other and all their followers. Soon, a church council tried to solve the problem by deposing both and electing a third pope. But the first two refused to resign, leaving Christendom with the absurd and scandalous spectacle of three rival popes. It was like having three different mothers-in-law. The situation was confusing, ruinously expensive, and they all insisted they were the only one who was right. The schism was a spiritual disaster, paralyzing the church and undermining its authority for a generation. Into this deeply fractured world stepped one of the most flamboyant, ambitious, and energetic rulers of the age, Sigismund of Luxembourg, the younger son of the great Emperor Charles IV. Sigismund was already King of Hungary by marriage when he was elected King of the Germans in 1411. He was a man on a grand scale, handsome, charming, a fluent speaker of 7 languages, and possessed of a restless, almost manic energy. He saw himself not merely as a German king, but as the secular leader of all Christendom. And he felt it was his personal, divinely appointed mission to end the chaos that was consuming both the empire and the church. His solution was the greatest international gathering of the entire Middle Ages, the Council of Constance. From 1414 to 1418, he used his tireless diplomatic skills to persuade, cajole, and bully all the powers of Europe into sending representatives to this small city on the shore of Lake Constance. The town was completely overwhelmed. For 4 years, it was the de facto capital of Europe, teeming with thousands of cardinals, archbishops, theologians, princes, and their vast retinues. It was an intellectual hub, a political marketplace, and a scene of rampant festivity and vice all at once. The council, convened under Sigismund's personal authority, had an immense agenda. First, to end the papal schism. Second, to deal with the growing problem of heresy. And third, to enact a thorough reform of the church in head and members. On the first point, after years of tortuous legal and political maneuvering, the council was a stunning success. With Sigismund constantly acting as a mediator and driving force, the council managed to depose or secure the resignation of all 3 popes. In November 1417, the assembled cardinals finally elected a single, universally recognized pope, Martin V. The Great Schism was over. The unity of the Church was restored, a monumental achievement for which Sigismund rightly took the credit. But the Council's second objective would lead to a tragedy that would overshadow this triumph and plunge the heart of the empire into war. The heresy in question was centered on a man named John Hus. He was a scholar and the rector of the University of Prague, a fiery and incredibly popular preacher who was deeply critical of the church's wealth and corruption. Inspired by the English reformer John Wycliffe, Huss preached that the ultimate religious authority was the Bible, not the pronouncements of a corrupt and divided papacy. His movement had taken on a powerful nationalistic dimension in Bohemia. Sigismund, who was also the heir to the Bohemian throne, wanted to resolve the issue peacefully. He summoned Hus to the council to defend his views and gave him the most solemn promise a king could give: an imperial safe conduct, guaranteeing his personal safety on his journey to, during, and from the council. Huss, trusting his king's word, went to Constance. It was a fatal mistake. The council fathers, many of whom saw any challenge to their authority as a mortal threat, had no interest in a debate. Huss was arrested, subjected to a sham trial, where he was not allowed to properly defend himself, and when he refused to recant his beliefs, he was condemned as a heretic. Sigismund, feeling the immense pressure from the council, and perhaps fearing he would be seen as a protector of heretics, was forced to stand by, as his own promise of safe conduct was violated. On July 6th, 1415, John Hus was handed over to the secular authorities, led to a field outside the city walls, and burned at the stake. He is said to have died singing hymns as the flames rose around him. The news of the judicial murder of their beloved preacher, a man burned in defiance of their own king's solemn guarantee of safety, hit Bohemia like a fireball. Hus was instantly acclaimed as a martyr and a national saint. A wave of furious indignation swept the kingdom, merging religious dissent with Czech national pride against German and papal dominance. The result was the Hussite rebellion. Fueled by religious zeal, the Bohemians rose in a full-scale war against the authority of both the Pope and their king, Sigismund. The Hussites, led by brilliant generals like the one-eyed Jan Žižka, developed revolutionary military tactics, most famously the Wagenburg, or wagon fort. By chaining together armored peasant wagons into a mobile fortress, their disciplined armies of commoners were able to withstand and defeat the charges of the finest feudal knights in Europe. Sigismund, now Holy Roman Emperor, spent the next 20 years leading a series of massive pan-European crusades against his own Hussite subjects, only to see his magnificent armies of German knights repeatedly and humiliatingly smashed to pieces by the Bohemian rebels. The great unifier of the Church had become the instigator of one of its most ferocious religious wars, a bloody and tragic legacy born from the ashes of a single man in Constance. While Emperor Sigismund was busy on the grand stage of European diplomacy, trying to mend the broken church and wage war against the Hussite rebels, a different and much stranger form of power was making itself felt within the German lands. The empire of the 15th century was a fractured and often lawless place. The emperor's authority was weak and distant, and the territorial princes, while growing in power, were often unable or unwilling to enforce justice beyond their own immediate interests. In this vacuum, where official law often failed, an older, more mysterious, and more terrifying system of justice re-emerged from the shadows: the secret courts of the Holy Weim. The Femic courts, or the Weim, were a peculiar phenomenon rooted in the soil of Westphalia, a region the initiates called the Red Earth. Here, an ancient tradition of free courts, which long predated the power of the territorial princes, had survived. These courts claimed a unique and fearsome authority. Their power, they insisted, came directly from the king and emperor himself, a sacred trust passed down from the time of Charlemagne. This meant they operated outside and above the legal structures of the local dukes, counts, and bishops. They were a parallel justice system, accountable to no one but God and the emperor. What made the Wehm so powerful was its structure. It was not a specific building or a government department, but a vast, secret society of initiated members known as the Freischaffen, or free jurors. To become a member, a free, honorable man had to be sponsored by two existing members and swear a terrifying oath upon holy relics. He would swear to uphold the secret laws of the Wehm, to answer its summons at any time, and above all, to never, under pain of death, reveal its secrets or the identity of his fellow members. By the early 15th century, this network had grown to include tens of thousands of initiated men from all walks of life: knights, merchants, artisans, and peasants, scattered across the length and breadth of the German Empire and even beyond. It was a vast, invisible web of informants and executioners. It was part secret fraternity, part vigilante network. The workings of the court were steeped in mystery and ritual. The process began with a summons. If you were accused of a serious crime like murder, robbery, rape, or heresy, you might find a cryptic note nailed to your door, or a special coin left on your threshold. This was the summons, ordering you to appear at a certain place and time to answer the charges. Receiving one was the medieval equivalent of a letter from the tax authorities, except with a much higher probability of being hanged. To ignore the summons was considered an admission of guilt, with fatal consequences. The court itself, the Heimliches Acht, or secret tribunal, was often convened in the open air, traditionally under a linden tree or at a crossroads, sometimes at the stroke of midnight. The presiding Freecount, or Freigraf, would sit at a table upon which lay a sword, representing justice, and a willow rope, representing punishment. The initiated free jurors would form the court around him. If the accused was brave enough to appear, he could attempt to prove his innocence by swearing a complex purification oath, and he had to be supported by the oaths of several other initiated members. If his oath was deemed valid, he was free to go. If he could not find enough oath helpers, or if he failed to appear at all, the verdict was swift and certain. The free jurors would cast their judgment, and the free count would declare the man verfempt, an outlaw, condemned to the rope. From that moment on, the condemned man's life was forfeit. Any initiated member of the Holy Wehm, anywhere in the empire, was now legally bound to execute the sentence on sight. This is what created the deep, pervasive terror of the Wehm. Justice was not carried out by a state executioner in a public square. It was carried out by your neighbor, by the merchant you traded with, by the innkeeper who served you a drink. A condemned man would simply be found one day, hanging from the branch of a tree, a dagger stuck in the trunk nearby, sometimes with a few coins to pay for his burial. The dagger and the coins were the calling card, the silent announcement that the judgment of the secret court had been fulfilled. This shadowy system has left a deeply ambiguous legacy, and historians still argue about the true nature of the Femic courts. Were they a legitimate, if archaic, force for order in a lawless age, or a dangerous, self-serving vigilante network that usurped royal authority? On one hand, in a time of political fragmentation, the Wehm was often the only institution capable of pursuing criminals across the dozens of petty borders that crisscrossed Germany. It provided a real deterrent to the robber knights and violent criminals who plagued the land. Emperors like Sigismund even occasionally used the courts as a tool to enforce their own judgments against powerful nobles who were otherwise untouchable. On the other hand, a secret court with no possibility of appeal was a system ripe for abuse. Personal vendettas could easily be cloaked in the language of formal accusation, and the power of the Veim could be used for extortion and political assassination. As the 15th century wore on, and the great territorial princes consolidated their power, they began to create their own, more professional and reliable systems of law and order. They came to see the Veim not as an aid, but as a dangerous rival. Slowly but surely, the princes began to suppress the secret courts, and the mysterious power of the free jurors faded into the mists of legend. In the middle of the 15th century, the world of information moved at the speed of a tired monk's hand. For 1,000 years, knowledge had been a rare and precious commodity, bound up in heavy, expensive books. Each book was a unique work of art, a luxury item painstakingly copied letter by letter, page by page, by skilled scribes in the quiet scriptoria of monasteries or in the workshops of university towns. To produce a single copy of the Bible could take a scribe more than a year of focused, eye-straining labor. Because of this, books were owned by institutions, the church, universities, the libraries of great princes, but almost never by individuals. The flow of information was a slow, shallow river, its course controlled entirely by the powerful and the learned. This entire world, a world built on the scarcity of the written word, was about to be utterly demolished by a goldsmith in the German city of Mainz. His name was Johannes Gutenberg. He was not a scholar or a priest, but a craftsman and an entrepreneur, a man familiar with the precise arts of metalworking, coin minting, and pressing wine. And he was obsessed with a single revolutionary idea. For years, in the utmost secrecy, he experimented, tinkered, and borrowed immense sums of money to fund his project. A project his financial backers must have thought was a mad gamble. His goal was to find a way to produce books that were as beautiful as the finest manuscripts, but to do so 100 times faster and at a fraction of the cost. The genius of Gutenberg's invention was not a single breakthrough, but the brilliant combination of three existing technologies into a single, world-changing system. The first and most important element was movable type. For centuries, people had used woodblocks to print simple images or single pages of text, but the block had to be carved whole and could be used for nothing else. Gutenberg, drawing on his expertise as a metallurgist, devised a way to create hundreds of identical, individual letters out of a durable alloy of lead, tin, and antimony. He created a handheld mold, or matrix, into which the molten metal could be poured, allowing for the rapid casting of any letter of the alphabet. A printer could now arrange these individual letters to form words, lock them into a frame to create a page, print as many copies as desired, and then redistribute the letters to create a completely new page of text. The second element was a new kind of ink. The watery, carbon-based ink used by scribes would simply run off the smooth metal type. So Gutenberg developed a new recipe, a thick, viscous, oil-based ink, more like a varnish, that would cling to the metal letters and transfer cleanly and sharply onto paper. The third element was the press itself. Gutenberg adapted the heavy screw press used by vintners to press grapes and by papermakers to squeeze water from pulp. This machine allowed him to apply immense and perfectly even pressure, ensuring that every letter on the page was printed with a uniform clarity that even the steadiest scribe could not match. It was this system, movable metal type, oil-based ink, and the screw press, that created the first true engine of mass communication. By the early 1450s, after years of secret development funded by a wealthy lawyer named Johann Fust, Gutenberg was ready for his masterwork. To prove the power and quality of his invention, he chose to print the most important and prestigious book in Christendom, the Latin Vulgate Bible. The result, known as the Gutenberg Bible, was a triumph of art and technology. It was a magnificent two-volume work of over 1,200 pages, printed with a clarity and precision that was breathtaking. He even designed the type to mimic the elegant handwriting of the best scribes and left wide margins and blank spaces for professional illustrators to later add the ornate, colorful initials and decorations by hand. His goal was not to make a cheap product, but to prove that his machine could rival and even surpass the quality of a handmade original. But in a moment of profound and bitter irony, as the last pages were being printed around 1455, Gutenberg's financial backer, Johann Fust, sued him for the repayment of the massive loans. Gutenberg lost the case. He was forced to turn over his presses, his unique metal type, and a large share of the finished Bibles to Fust, who promptly went into business with Gutenberg's own skilled foreman. Peter Schoeffer, the man who had invented the printing press, was financially ruined and cast into relative obscurity just at the moment of his greatest triumph. The Scribes' Union, if one had existed, would have been delighted. But the secret was out. Printers who had learned the new craft in Gutenberg's workshop quickly scattered, seeking their own fortunes. Within a decade, printing presses had been established in cities all along the Rhine. Within a generation, they were operating in every major country in Europe. The effect was an information explosion, a revolution in communication as profound as the invention of the internet. The price of books plummeted. A printed book that once would have cost a skilled craftsman half a year's wages could now be bought for the price of a few days' work. Knowledge that had been the exclusive property of a clerical and noble elite was now available to a rapidly growing audience of merchants, lawyers, students, and literate townspeople. The slow river of information had become a raging, uncontrollable flood. At first, the printers focused on Bibles and traditional religious texts, but they soon discovered a booming market for pamphlets, satires, political tracts, and woodcut illustrations. This new technology, born in a workshop on a back street in Mainz, was more than just a new way of making books. It was a new way of making arguments, of spreading dissent, of challenging authority. It was the weapon that would, in the hands of another German a few decades later, make the Protestant Reformation possible, spreading his ideas with the speed that Pope and Emperor could no longer control. In the latter half of the 15th century, the German imperial crown was restored, after a long interlude, to the House of Habsburg in the person of Frederick III. His reign was one of the longest in German history, stretching for over 50 years. But it was a quiet, passive, and often frustrating period. Frederick was a sluggish and reactive ruler, a man whose personal motto was, "He who has the time has the victory." He faced constant challenges, losing control of both Bohemia and Hungary, and was even besieged in his own palace in Vienna by rebellious subjects. Yet, through sheer stubborn persistence, he clung to the imperial title, keeping it in the Habsburg family and setting the stage for his son, a man who could not have been more different from his dour and cautious father. This son was Maximilian I, who became king of the Germans in 1486. His arrival on the scene was like a sudden, brilliant burst of sunlight after a long, grey afternoon. Maximilian was a whirlwind of energy, endlessly charismatic, chivalrous, a gifted linguist, a passionate patron of the arts, and a man utterly captivated by the romantic ideals of knighthood. He loved nothing more than the thrill of the hunt, the spectacle of the joust, and the intricate beauty of a well-made suit of armor. He saw himself as the heir to a long line of heroic figures, a knight-errant on an imperial scale, a persona that would earn him the enduring nickname, the Last Knight. But beneath this shining armor of medieval nostalgia beat the heart of a thoroughly modern and ambitious political strategist. Maximilian's greatest genius lay in the field of dynastic politics. His personal motto might as well have been the famous Habsburg maxim, Bella gerant ali, tu Felix Austria, nube. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. He played the game of European marriage politics with a skill that bordered on prophetic. His own marriage to Mary of Burgundy, the sole heiress to the fabulously wealthy Duchy of Burgundy, and the bustling commercial centers of the Netherlands, was a spectacular coup that instantly made the Habsburgs a major power in Western Europe. But his true masterstroke was the double marriage he arranged for his children with the heirs to the Spanish throne. His son, Philip the Handsome, was married to Joanna, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. This single move would, within a generation, unite the immense Habsburg domains in Germany and the Netherlands with the crowns of Spain and its vast, gold-rich empire in the New World. It was the dynastic equivalent of a monopoly player shrewdly acquiring both Boardwalk and Park Place, setting the stage for his family to dominate the entire board. This forward-thinking prince was also a military innovator. He was fascinated by the new power of artillery and was instrumental in creating a new kind of German infantry, the famous Landsknechte. These flamboyant, pike-wielding mercenary soldiers, with their distinctive slashed sleeve doublets, were designed to counter the battlefield dominance of the feared Swiss pikemen. Yet for all his grand plans, for a crusade against the Ottoman Turks, for great wars to reclaim his Burgundian inheritance from France, Maximilian was constantly and comically thwarted by one simple problem. He was always broke. The German princes, ever jealous of their own power, consistently refused to grant him the taxes he needed to fund a modern, standing imperial army. His reign was a constant, frustrating scramble for cash, a whirlwind of brilliant ideas, forever running aground on the shoals of an empty treasury. He knew that to get the money he needed, he would have to reform the empire's dysfunctional constitution. At a great imperial diet held in the city of Worms in 1495, he and the princes embarked on a major project of institutional renewal, the Reichsreform. After months of negotiation, they agreed to a landmark package. First, they proclaimed the ewige Landfriede, or perpetual public peace, a formal and permanent ban on the private wars and feuds that had been the curse of German political life for centuries. Second, to enforce this peace, they created a new Supreme Court, the Reichskammergericht, or Imperial Cameral Court, where disputes between the territories of the empire could be settled by law rather than by the sword. Third, and most revolutionary, they proposed a new imperial tax, the Gemeine Pfennig, or common penny, to provide the emperor with the funds to run these new institutions. The peace and the court were lasting achievements that gave the empire a new degree of legal order. The tax, however, was a spectacular failure. The princes, the cities, and the people all resisted it, and the emperor remained as poor as ever. Despite his medieval persona, Maximilian was a master of the most modern of arts, public relations. He was one of the first rulers to fully grasp the immense power of the printing press, the revolutionary technology that had been born in his empire just a generation earlier. He commissioned a series of magnificent, lavishly illustrated books, like the chivalric allegories Theurdank and Weisskönig, and breathtakingly complex series of woodcuts, like the colossal, triumphal Arch of Maximilian. These were not meant for a small, courtly audience. They were printed works of propaganda, designed for mass distribution, all intended to craft a heroic public image of Maximilian himself, celebrating his chivalry, his military prowess, and the glorious destiny of the House of Habsburg. He was the last knight, but he was also the first king to truly campaign for his own legacy. He was a bridge between two worlds, a man with his heart in the chivalric past and his mind on the dynastic and technological future. He failed to create the strong, centralized Germany he dreamed of, but his reign of restless, creative, and often frustrated energy prepared the empire for the dawn of a new and turbulent century. As the 15th century drew to its close, the Germany that Maximilian I ruled over was a land of profound and bewildering contradictions. The Holy Roman Empire, as the great philosopher Voltaire would later quip, was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. It was a magnificent, ramshackle, and deeply fragmented political entity, a shimmering mosaic of over 300 separate territories, mighty duchies like Bavaria, powerful archbishoprics like Mainz, wealthy free cities like Nuremberg, and countless tiny counties and lordships, each fiercely protective of its own rights and privileges. The emperor, for all his grand titles, was a weak monarch, his power checked at every turn by the great princes who had been the true masters of Germany since the Golden Bull. And yet, the imperial idea endured, and the House of Habsburg, through Maximilian's brilliant marriage politics, was now poised on the brink of becoming the most powerful dynasty, not just in the empire, but in the entire world. This political fragmentation was mirrored by a vibrant but tense social landscape. The great cities of southern Germany, like Augsburg and Nuremberg, were humming with a dynamic, early capitalist energy. Great banking families, like the Fuggers of Augsburg, had become true powers in their own right. Jacob Fugger, known as the Rich, was so fantastically wealthy that he personally financed the elections of Holy Roman emperors and lent vast sums to popes and kings. his financial empire stretching from the silver mines of the Tyrol to the spice markets of Antwerp. The Hanseatic cities of the north still controlled the trade of the Baltic, but this new urban wealth created stark new social divisions. In the countryside, the peasantry was squeezed by rising rents and feudal obligations, their ancient rights being eroded by landlords eager to cash in on the new commercial economy. In the cities, a growing urban proletariat of journeymen and laborers looked with resentment at the wealthy merchant oligarchs who ran the town councils. There was a deep and simmering anger throughout the lower orders of society, a sense of injustice that was searching for a voice. The institution that should have provided the moral glue to hold this fractured world together, the church, was itself in a state of profound crisis. To many Germans, the papacy in Rome seemed like a foreign power, an Italian state run by worldly Renaissance princes who were more interested in commissioning great art and waging petty wars than in the spiritual well-being of the faithful. Germany, in particular, felt like the Pope's piggy bank, a territory to be endlessly drained of funds through tithes, fees, and annats to pay for the lavish building projects and political schemes of the popes. The most blatant and galling form of this was the ever-expanding sale of indulgences. This began as a genuinely pious idea, a way for a repentant sinner to reduce their time in purgatory. But by the late 15th century, it had devolved into a massive, high-pressure fundraising scheme. Preachers like the Dominican friar Johann Tetzel would travel the land, using sophisticated marketing techniques to sell papal letters that promised a full remission of sins, a get-out-of-jail-free card for the soul, but with a hefty processing fee. You could even buy them for your dead relatives. Into this dry, combustible landscape, two new forces were introduced. The first was the new learning of Christian humanism. Scholars like the great Erasmus of Rotterdam were using the tools of the Renaissance to go back to the original sources of Christianity. Studying the Bible in its original Greek, they promoted a simpler, more personal, and more Christ-centered faith. And they wrote savage, witty satires, mocking the absurd superstitions of popular religion and the ignorance of the scholastic theologians who ran the universities. The second force was, of course, the printing press. By 1500, presses were operating in over 60 German towns. The price of books had fallen, and literacy, while still not common, was rising fast, especially among the merchants and artisans of the cities. The press was churning out a torrent of material: Bibles, prayer books, and devotional works, but also cheap, inflammatory pamphlets and satirical woodcuts that lampooned the fat, greedy monks and the distant, arrogant pope. All the pieces were now in place for a cataclysm, a politically fragmented empire where a central authority could not enforce religious unity, a society seething with economic and social resentments, a church whose moral authority was bankrupt and widely despised, a new intellectual movement that questioned the very foundations of that church, and a revolutionary technology capable of spreading new and radical ideas with a speed that was utterly uncontrollable. The German Middle Ages had come to an end, leaving behind a complex, dynamic, and deeply troubled world, a powder keg of spiritual longing and social anger. All that was missing was a single spark. That spark would be struck in 1517, in the obscure university town of Wittenberg in Saxony by a troubled Augustinian monk named Martin Luther, and the fire he lit would change the world forever. And so, our long journey through the German Middle Ages comes to a gentle close as the sun sets on the world of knights and emperors, and the first stars of a new and different age begin to appear in the twilight sky. The great story we have followed of the forging of a kingdom from the fragments of Charlemagne's dream now fades into the quiet of the evening. The clamor of the Italian wars, the solemn pronouncements of the imperial diets, and the ring of the craftsman's hammer in the bustling towns all begin to soften, becoming mere echoes in the vast corridors of time. The great figures we have met, the pragmatic Henry the Fowler, the magnificent Otto the Great, the tragic Frederick Barbarossa sleeping in his mountain tomb, and the brilliant, misunderstood Frederick II, all now take their leave, receding into the pages of a book that is slowly closing. The soaring arches of the great Gothic cathedrals now stand silent in the moonlight, monuments to an age of faith and ambition that has passed into memory. The struggles that seemed so urgent have all been resolved by the slow, patient work of the centuries, and the forests have long since grown over the crumbling walls of the robber knights' castles. Let the intricate tapestry of their world, with its feud and its faith, its famines and its festivals, now gently unravel in your mind. There is nothing left to resolve, nothing left to strive for. The story is told, and the long night is peaceful. All that is left to do is to rest and to let the deep, quiet darkness carry you into your own world of dreams.